Christopher Manafort downloaded the Administration app on the date of the Trump Tower meeting. Christopher Manafort downloaded the encrypted app on the date of the
Gavel. Retreat, please, to your reserve position and get down. TV's.
Idiot.
Sherry, you think you'd wait for someone to say something first? Get the cameras through.
Okay.
I don't know.
The Judiciary Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on oversight of the report on the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. I will now recognize myself for a brief opening statement. Director Mueller, thank you for being here. I want to say just a few words about our themes today: responsibility, integrity, and accountability. Your career, for example, is a model of responsibility. You are a decorated Marine officer. You were awarded a Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for Valor in Vietnam. You served in senior roles at the Department of Justice, and in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, you served as director of the FBI. 2 years ago, you returned to public service to lead the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 elections. You conducted that investigation with remarkable integrity. For 22 months, you never commented in public about your work, even when you were subjected to repeated and grossly unfair personal attacks. Instead, your indictments spoke for you, and in astonishing detail. Over the course of your investigation, you obtained criminal indictments against 37 people and entities. You secured the conviction of President Trump's campaign chairman, his deputy campaign manager, his national security advisor, and his personal lawyer, among others. In the Paul Manafort case alone, you recovered as much as $42 million, so that the cost of your investigation to the taxpayers approaches zero. And in your report, you offer the country accountability as well. In Volume 1, you find that the Russian government attacked our 2016 elections, quote, in a sweeping and systematic fashion, and that the attacks were designed to benefit the Trump campaign. Volume 2 walks us through 10 separate incidents of possible obstruction of justice, where, in your words, President Trump attempted to exert undue influence over your investigation. The president's behavior included, and I quote from your report, quote, public attacks on the investigation, non-public efforts to control it, and efforts in both public and private to encourage witnesses not to cooperate, close quote. Among the most shocking of these incidents, President Trump ordered his White House counsel to have you fired, and then to lie and deny that it had happened. He ordered his former campaign manager to convince the recused Attorney General to step in and limit your work. And he attempted to prevent witnesses from cooperating with your investigation. Although department policy barred you from indicting the president for this conduct, you made clear that he is not exonerated. Any other person who acted in this way would have been charged with crimes. And in this nation, not even the president is above the law. Which brings me to this committee's work: responsibility, integrity, and accountability. These are the marks by which we who serve on this committee will be measured as well. Director Mueller, we have a responsibility to address the evidence that you have uncovered. You recognize as much when you said, quote, the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, close quote. That process begins with the work of this committee. We will follow your example, Director Mueller. We will act with integrity. We will follow the facts where they lead. We will consider all appropriate remedies. We will make our recommendation to the House when our work concludes. We will do this work because there must be accountability for the conduct described in your report, especially as it relates to the President. Thank you again, Director Mueller. We look forward to your testimony. It is now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Mueller, for being here. For 2 years leading up to the release of the Mueller report, and in the 3 months since, Americans were first told what to expect and then what to believe. Collusion, we were told, was in plain sight, even if the special counsel's team didn't find it. When Mr. Mueller produced his report and Attorney General Barr provided it to every American, we read no American conspired with Russia to interfere in our elections, but learned the depths of Russia's malice toward America. We are here to ask serious questions about Mr. Mueller's work, and we will do that. After an extended, unhampered investigation, today marks an end to Mr. Mueller's involvement in an investigation that closed in April. The burden of proof for accusations that remain unproven is extremely high, and especially in light of the special counsel's thoroughness. We are told this investigation began as an inquiry into whether Russia meddled in our 2016 election. Mr. Mueller, you concluded they did. Russians accessed Democrat servers and disseminated sensitive information by tricking campaign insiders into revealing protected information. The investigation also reviewed whether Donald Trump, the president, sought Russian assistance as a candidate to win the presidency. Mr. Mueller concluded he did not. His family or advisors did not. In fact, the report concludes no one in the president's campaign colluded, collaborated, or conspired with the Russians. The president watched the public narrative surrounding this investigation, assume his guilt while he knew the extent of his innocence. Volume 2 of Mr. Mueller's report details the president's reaction to frustrating investigation where his innocence was established early on. The president's attitude toward the investigation was understandably negative, yet the president did not use his authority to close the investigation. He asked his lawyer if Mr. Mueller had conflicts that disqualified Mr. Mueller from the job, but he did not shut down the investigation. The president knew he was innocent. Those are the facts of the Mueller report. Russia meddled in the 2016 election, the president did not conspire with the Russian, and nothing we hear today will change those facts. But one element of this story remains, the beginnings of the FBI investigation into the president. I look forward to Mr. Mueller's testimony about what he found during his review of the origins of the investigation. In addition, the Inspector General continues to review how baseless gossip can be used to launch an FBI investigation against a private citizen and eventually a president. Those results will be released and we will need to learn from them to ensure government intelligence and law enforcement powers are never again used and turned on a private citizen or a potential or political candidate as a result of the political leanings of a handful of FBI agents. The origins and conclusions of the Mueller investigation are the same things, what it means to be American. Every American has a voice in our democracy, so it must protect the sanctity of their voice by combating election interference. Every American enjoys the presumption of innocence and guarantee of due process. If we carry anything away today, it must be that we increase our vigilance against foreign election interference while we ensure our government officials don't weaponize their power against the constitutional rights guaranteed to every U.S. citizen. Finally, we must agree that the opportunity cost here is too high. The months we have spent investigating from this dais failed to end the border crisis or contribute to the growing job market. Instead, we have gotten stuck and it's paralyzed this committee and this House. And as a side note, every week I leave my family and kids, the most important things to me, to come to this place because I believe this place is a place where we can actually do things and help people. 6.5 years ago, I came here to work on behalf of the people of the 9th District in this country. And we accomplished a lot in those first 6 years on a bipartisan basis with many of my friends across the aisle sitting on this dais with me today. However, this year, because the majority's dislike of this president and the endless hearing into a closed investigation have caused us to accomplish nothing except talk about the problems of our country while our border is on fire and in crisis and everything else is stopped. This hearing is long overdue. We have had truth for months. No American conspired to throw our election. What we need today is to let that truth bring us confidence and I hope, Mr. Chairman, closure. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I will now introduce today's witness. Robert Mueller served as director of the FBI from 2001 to 2013, and most recently served as special counsel in the Department of Justice, overseeing the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 special election. He received his BA from Princeton University, an MA from New York University in my district, and his JD from the University of Virginia. Mr. Mueller is accompanied by counsel Aaron Zebley, who served as Deputy Special Counsel on the investigation. We welcome our distinguished witness, and we thank you for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. Would you raise your right hand, please? Or left hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witness answered the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Director Mueller, you may begin.
Good morning, Chairman Nadler, and Ranking Member Collins, and the members of the committee.
Liar.
As you know, in May 2017, the Acting Attorney General asked me to serve as special counsel. I undertook that role because I believed that it was of paramount interest to the nation to determine whether a foreign adversary had interfered in the presidential election. As the Acting Attorney General said at the time, the appointment was necessary in order for the American people to have full confidence in the outcome. My staff and I carried out this assignment with that critical objective in mind: to work quietly, thoroughly, and with integrity so that the public would have full confidence in the outcome. The order appointing me as special counsel directed our office to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. This included investigating any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. It also included investigating efforts to interfere with or obstruct our investigation. Throughout the investigation, I continually stressed two things to the team that we had assembled. First, we needed to do our work as thoroughly as possible and as expeditiously as possible. It was in the public interest for our investigation to be complete, but not to last a day longer than was necessary. Second, the investigation needed to be conducted fairly and with absolute integrity. Our team would not leak or take other actions that could compromise the integrity of our work. All decisions were made based on the facts and the law. During the course of our investigation, we charged more than 30 defendants with committing federal crimes, including 12 officers of the Russian military. 7 defendants have been convicted or pled guilty. Certain of the charges we brought remain pending today. And for those matters, I stress that the indictments contain allegations, and every defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. In addition to the criminal charges we brought, as required by Justice Department regulations, we submitted a confidential report to the Attorney General at the conclusion of our investigation. The report set forth the results of our work and the reasons for our charging and declination decisions. The Attorney General later made the report largely public. As you know, I made a few limited remarks about our report when we closed the special counsel's office in May of this year. But there are certain points that bear emphasis. First, our investigation found that the Russian government interfered in our election in sweeping and systematic fashion. Second, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired with the Russian government in its election interference activities. We did not address collusion, which is not a legal term. Rather, we focused on whether the evidence was sufficient to charge any member of the campaign with taking part in a criminal conspiracy, and it was not. Third, our investigation of efforts to obstruct the investigation and lie to investigators was of critical importance. Obstruction of justice strikes at the core of the government's effort to find the truth and to hold wrongdoers accountable. Finally, as described in Volume 2 of our report, we investigated a series of actions by the President towards the investigation. Based on Justice Department policy and principles of fairness, we decided we would not make a determination as to whether the President committed a crime. That was our decision then, and it remains our decision today. Let me say a further word about my appearance today. It is unusual for a prosecutor to testify about a criminal investigation. And given my role as a prosecutor, there are reasons why my testimony will necessarily be limited.
President in this manner.
First, public testimony could affect several ongoing matters. In some of these matters, court rules or judicial orders limit the disclosure of information to protect the fairness of the proceedings. And consistent with long-standing Justice Department policy, it would be inappropriate for me to comment in any way that could affect an ongoing matter. Second, the Justice Department has asserted privileges concerning investigative information and decisions, ongoing matters within the Justice Department, and deliberations within our office. These are Justice Department privileges that I will respect. The Department has released a letter discussing the restrictions on my testimony. I therefore will not be able to answer questions about certain areas that I know are of public interest. For example, I am unable to address questions about the initial opening of the FBI's Russia investigation, which occurred months before my appointment, or matters related to the so-called Steele dossier. These matters are subject of ongoing review by the Department. Any questions on these topics should therefore be directed to the FBI or the Justice Department. As I explained when we closed the special counsel's office in May, our report
all of
contains
these
our
calls
findings
by Donald Trump for him to
and
answer these
analysis
questions, and the
and the
Republicans are
reasons
going
for
to
the
ask
decisions we
him,
made.
how did this start?
We
What were
conducted an
these two
extensive
FBI agents
investigation
writing
over
to
2
each other?
years.
His own
Writing the
DOJ said he's
report,
not allowed to answer
We
those.
stated the results of our
He could, but he doesn't
investigation
want to.
with precision. We scrutinized every word. I do not intend to summarize or describe the results of our work in a different way in the course of my testimony today. And as I said on May 29th, the report is my testimony, and I will stay within that text. And as I stated in May, I will not comment on the actions of the Attorney General or of Congress. I was appointed as a prosecutor, and I intend to adhere to that role and to the Department standards that govern it. I'll be joined today by Deputy Special Counsel Aaron Zebley. Mr. Zebley has extensive experience as a federal prosecutor and at the FBI, where he served as my Chief of Staff. And Mr. Zebley was responsible for the day-to-day oversight of the investigations conducted by our office. Now, I also want to again say thank you to the attorneys, the FBI agents, the analysts, the professional staff who helped us conduct this investigation in a fair and independent manner. These individuals who spent nearly 2 years of working on this matter were of the highest integrity. And let me say one more thing. Over the course of my career, I have seen a number of challenges to our democracy. The Russian government's effort to interfere in our election is among the most serious. And as I said on May 29th, this deserves the attention of every American. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Director Mueller, the President has repeatedly claimed that your report found there was no obstruction and that it completely and totally exonerated him. But that is not what your report said, is it?
Correct. It is not what the report said.
And now, reading from page 2 of volume 2 of your report that's on the screen, you wrote, quote, If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the President clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment, close quote. Now, does that say there was no obstruction?
No.
In fact, you are actually unable to conclude the President did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
Well, we, at the outset, determined that we, when it came to the President's culpability, we needed to go forward only after taking into account the OLC opinion that indicated that a president, a sitting president, cannot be indicted.
So the report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the President?
No.
Now, in fact, your report expressly states that it does not exonerate the President.
It does.
And your investigation actually found, quote, multiple acts by the President that were capable of exerting undue influence over law enforcement investigations, including the Russian interference and obstruction investigations. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, Director Mueller, can you explain in plain terms what that finding means so the American people can understand it?
Well, the finding indicates that the President was not that the President was not exculpated for the acts that he allegedly committed.
Plain terms. Right.
In fact,
Oh,
we're talking
exculpated.
about
Thank you.
incidents, quote, in which the President sought to use his official power outside of usual channels, unquote, to exert undue influence over your investigations.
Yeah,
Is that
I'm
right?
a criminal.
That's correct.
Duh.
Now, am I correct that on page 7 of volume 2 of your report, you wrote, quote, the President became aware that his own conduct was being investigated in an obstruction of justice inquiry. At that point, the President engaged in a second phase of conduct involving public attacks on the investigation, non-public efforts to control it, and efforts in both public and private to encourage witnesses not to cooperate with the investigation, close quote. So President Trump's efforts to exert undue influence over your investigation intensified after the President became aware that he personally was being investigated?
I stick with the language that you have in front of you,
Which
which
Okay.
comes from page 7, volume 2.
Now, is it correct that if you concluded that the President committed the crime of obstruction, you could not publicly state that in your report or here today?
Can you repeat the question, sir?
Is it correct that if you had concluded that the President committed the crime of obstruction, you could not publicly state that in your report or here today?
Well, I would say the statement would be that you would not indict, and you would not indict because under the OLC opinion, a sitting president, excuse me, cannot be indicted, be unconstitutional.
So you could not state that because of the OLC opinion, if that would have been your conclusion?
OLC opinion was some guide, yes.
But under DOJ,
some
under Department
guy.
of Justice policy,
He's being
the President
evasive.
could be
He's not
prosecuted for
saying what
obstruction
he's
of
saying in
justice
the
crimes
report. He's being
after he leaves
evasive. He doesn't
office,
want to
correct?
say this
True.
shit.
Thank you.
He's
Did any
afraid.
senior White House official refuse a request to be interviewed by you
And
and your
Vito
team?
Spatafor from The Sopranos is
I
getting
don't believe
pissed.
so.
Shouts
I
to
take-
David Feldman.
Let me
Yeah.
take that back. I would have to look at it, but I'm not certain that that was the case.
Did the President refuse a request to be interviewed by you and your team?
Yes,
Yes. And is it true that you tried for more than a year to secure an interview with the President?
yes,
And is it true that you and your team advised the President's lawyer that, quote, an interview with the President is vital to our investigation, close
yes,
quote?
yes,
And is it true that you also, quote, stated that it is in the interest of the presidency and the public for an interview to take place, close quote?
yes,
But the President still refused to sit for an interview by you or your team?
true, true.
And did you also ask him to provide written answers to questions on the 10 possible episodes of obstruction of justice crimes involving him?
Yes,
Did he provide any answers to a single question about whether he engaged in obstruction of justice crimes?
I would have to check on that. I'm not certain.
Director Mueller, we are grateful that you are here to explain your investigation and findings. Having reviewed your work, I believe anyone else who would engage in the conduct described in your report would have been criminally prosecuted. Your work is vitally important to this committee and the American people because no one is above the law. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mueller, isn't it true that there's a lot of black people in this country?
Mr. Mueller, I have several questions, many of which that you just answered will be questioned here in a moment, but I want to lay some foundation, so we'll go through these fairly quickly. I'll talk slowly. I've said that I talk fast. I will talk slowly.
Thank you, sir.
In your press conference, you stated any testimony from your office would not go beyond our report. We chose these words carefully. The work speaks for itself. I would not provide information beyond that which is already public in any appearance before Congress. Do you stand by that statement?
Yes.
Since closing the special counsel's office in May of 2019, have you conducted any additional interviews or obtained any new information in your role as special counsel?
In the wake of the report?
Since the closing of the office in May of 2019.
And the question was,
have you conducted any new interviews and any new witnesses?
I'm starting to understand why I didn't.
And you can't confirm you're no longer special counsel.
I'm starting to
correct?
understand how he was able to entrap mentally slow people.
At any time with the investigation, was your investigation curtailed or stopped or hindered?
No.
Were you or your team provided any questions by members of Congress of the majority ahead of your hearing today?
No.
Your report states that your investigative team included 19 lawyers and approximately 40 FBI agents and analysts and accountants. Are those numbers accurate?
Could you repeat that, please?
40 FBI agents, 19 lawyers, intelligence analysts, and forensic accountants. Are those numbers accurate? This was included in your report.
Generally, yes.
Is it also true that you issued over 2,800 subpoenas, executed nearly 500 search warrants, obtained more than 230 orders for communication records, and 50 pen registers?
That went a little fast for me.
Okay. In your report, I'll make this very simple. You did a lot of work, correct?
Yes, that I agree to.
A lot of subpoenas, a lot of pen registers.
A lot of subpoenas. Yes.
Okay, we'll walk this really slow if we need to.
A lot of search warrants.
All right, a lot of search warrants, a lot of things. So you're very thorough.
What?
In your opinion, very thorough. You listed this out in your report, correct?
Thoroughly
Yes.
exonerated.
Thank you. Is it true the evidence gathered during your investigation, given the questions that you have just answered, is it true the evidence gathered during your investigation did not establish that the president was involved in the underlying crime related to Russian election interference as stated in Volume 1, page 7?
We found insufficient evidence of the president's culpability.
So that would be a yes.
Without, pardon?
That would be a yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Isn't it true the evidence did not establish that the president or those close to him were involved in the charged Russian computer hacking or active measure conspiracies, or that the president otherwise had unlawful relationships with any Russian official? Volume 2, page 76, correct?
I leave the answer to our report.
So as a yes. Is that any true your investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with Russian government in the election interference activity? Volume 1, page 2, Volume 1, page 173.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Although your report states collusion is not so specific offense, and you said that this morning, or a term of art in federal criminal law, conspiracy is. In the colloquial context, are collusion and conspiracy essentially synonymous terms?
You're going to have to repeat that for me.
Good after repeat
Collusion
that.
is not a specific offense or a term of art in the federal criminal law. Conspiracy is.
Yes.
In the colloquial context, known public context, collusion and conspiracy are essentially synonymous terms, correct?
No.
If no, on page 180 of volume 1 of your report, you wrote, as defined in legal dictionaries, collusion is largely synonymous with conspiracy, as that crime is set forth in the General Federal Conspiracy Statute 18 U.S.C. 371. You said at your May 29th press conference and here today, you choose your words carefully. Are you sitting here today testifying something different than what your report states?
Well, what I'm asking is if you can give me the citation, I can look at the citation and evaluate whether it is accurate.
Okay, let me just be clarified. You stated that you would stay within the report. I just stated your report back to you. And you said that collusion and conspiracy were not synonymous terms. That was your answer, was no.
That's correct.
In that, page 180 of volume 1 of your report, it says, as defined in legal dictionaries, collusion is largely synonymous with conspiracy, as that crime is set forth in General Conspiracy Statute 18 U.S.C. 371. Now, you said you chose your words carefully. Are you contradicting your report right now?
Not when I read it.
So you would change your answer to yes then?
No. If you look at the language.
I'm reading your report, sir. It's a yes or no answer.
Page 180.
Page 180, volume 1.
Okay.
This was from your report.
Correct. And I'll leave it with the report.
So the report says, yes, they are synonymous.
Yes.
Hopefully, finally, out of your own report, we can put to bed the collusion and conspiracy.
that is
One last
a problem,
question
isn't
as
it?
we're going through. Did you ever look into other countries investigated in the Russian interference into our election? Were other countries investigated?
That's a big deal.
Or found knowledge that they had interference in our election?
I'm not going to discuss other matters.
That I yield back.
Gentleman yields
Emirates.
back. The gentlelady from California.
Director Mueller, as you've heard from the chairman, we're mostly going to talk about obstruction of justice today, but the investigation of Russia's attack that started your investigation is why evidence of possible obstruction is serious. To what extent did the Russian government interfere in the 2016 presidential election?
Could you repeat that, ma'am?
To what extent did the Russian government interfere in the 2016 presidential election?
Well, particularly when it came to computer crimes and the like, the government was implicated.
So you wrote in volume 1 that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. You also described in your report that the then Trump campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, shared with a Russian operative, Kilimnik, the campaign strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states and internal polling data of the campaign. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
They also discussed the status of the Trump campaign and Manafort's strategy for winning Democratic votes in Midwestern states. Months before that meeting, Manafort had caused internal data to be shared with Kilimnik, and the sharing continued for some period of time after their August meeting. Isn't that correct?
Accurate.
In fact, your investigation found that Manafort briefed Kilimnik on the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election, and that briefing encompassed the campaign's messaging, its internal polling data. It also included discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identified as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Did your investigation determine who requested the polling data to be shared with Kilimnik?
Well, I would direct you to the report and adopt what we have in the report with regard to that particular issue.
We don't have the redacted version. That's maybe another reason why we should get that for Volume 1. Based on your investigation, how could the Russian government have used this campaign polling data to further its sweeping and systematic interference in the 2016 presidential election?
That's a little bit out of our path.
Fair enough. Did your investigation find that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from one of the candidates winning?
Yes.
And which candidate would that be?
Well, it would be Trump.
Correct.
It was
Now,
Trump.
The Trump
He was a
campaign wasn't
third-party
exactly
candidate.
reluctant to take Russian help. You wrote it expected it would benefit
Someone find Trump.
electorally from information
Who the
stolen
hell
and
is Trump?
released through Russian efforts. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, was the investigation's determination, what was the investigation's determination regarding the frequency with which the Trump campaign made contact with the Russian government?
Well, I would have to refer you to the report on that.
Well, we went through and we counted 126 contacts between Russians or their agents and Trump campaign officials or their associates. So would that sound about right?
I can't say. I understand the statistic, and I believe it. I understand the statistic.
Well, Mr. Mueller, I appreciate your being here and your report. From your testimony and the report, I think the American people have learned several things. First, the Russians wanted Trump to win.
Trump.
Second, the Russians went on a sweeping cyber
Everybody
influence
wanted me to
campaign.
win because I was the best.
The Russians hacked the DNC, and they got the Democratic game plan for the election. The Russian campaign chairman met with Russian agents and repeatedly gave them
We don't
internal
even need to
data,
hack.
polling, and messaging in the battleground states. So while the Russians were buying ads and creating propaganda to influence the outcome of the election, they were armed with inside information that they had stolen through hacking from the DNC and that they had been given by the Trump campaign chairman, Mr. Manafort. My colleagues will probe the efforts undertaken to keep this information from becoming public, but I think it's important for the American people to understand the gravity of the underlying problem that your report uncovered. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Gentlelady.
Good morning, Director. If you'll let me quickly summarize your opening statement this morning. You said in Volume 1 on the issue of conspiracy, the special counsel determined that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. And then in Volume 2, for reasons that you explained, the special counsel did not make a determination on whether there was an obstruction of justice crime committed by the president. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
All right, now in explaining that special counsel did not make what you called a traditional prosecution or declination decision, the report on the bottom of page 2 of volume 2 reads as follows. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Now, I read that correctly?
Yes.
All right. Now, your report, and today you said at all times the special counsel team operated under, was guided by, and followed Justice Department policies and principles. So, which DOJ policy or principle sets forth a legal standard that an investigated person is not exonerated if their innocence from criminal conduct is not conclusively determined?
Can you repeat the last part of that question?
Yeah. Which DOJ policy or principle set forth a legal standard that an investigated person is not exonerated if their innocence from criminal conduct is not conclusively determined? Where does that language come from, Director? Where is the DOJ policy that says that? Can you, let me make it easier.
Go ahead.
Can you give me an example other than Donald Trump where the Justice Department determined that an investigated person was not exonerated because their innocence was not conclusively determined?
I cannot, but this is a unique situation.
Okay, well, you can't. Time is short. I've got 5 minutes. Let's just leave it at you can't find it because I'll tell you why. It doesn't exist. The special counsel's job, nowhere does it say that you were to conclusively determine Donald Trump's innocence or that the special counsel report should determine whether or not to exonerate him. It's not in any of the documents. It's not in your appointment order. It's not in the special counsel regulations. It's not in the OLC opinions. It's not in the Justice Manual, and it's not in the principles of federal prosecution. Nowhere do those words appear together because respectfully, Director, it was not the special counsel's job to conclusively determine Donald Trump's innocence or to exonerate him, because the bedrock principle of our justice system is a presumption of innocence. It exists for everyone. Everyone is entitled to it, including sitting presidents. And because there is a presumption of innocence, prosecutors never, ever need to conclusively determine it. Now, Director, the special counsel applied this inverted burden of proof that I can't find and you said doesn't exist anywhere in the department policies, and you used it to write a report. And the very first line of your report, says, and as you read this morning, it authorizes the special counsel to provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions reached by the special counsel. That's the very first word of your report, right?
That's correct.
Here's the problem, Director. The special counsel didn't do that. On Volume 1, you did. On Volume 2, with respect to potential obstruction of justice, the special counsel made neither a prosecution decision or a declination decision. You made no decision. You told us this morning and in your report that you made no determination. So respectfully, Director, you didn't follow the special counsel regulations. It clearly says, write a confidential report about decisions reached. Nowhere in here does it say, write a report about decisions that weren't reached. You wrote 180 pages about decisions that weren't reached, about potential crimes that weren't charged or decided. And respectfully, by doing that, you managed to violate every principle and the most sacred of traditions about prosecutors not offering extra prosecutorial analysis about potential crimes that aren't charged. So Americans need to know this as they listen to the Democrats and socialists on the other side of the aisle as they do dramatic readings from this report, that volume 2 of this report was not authorized under the law to be written. It was written to a legal standard that does not exist at the Justice Department. And it was written in violation of every DOJ principle about extra prosecutorial commentary. I agree with the chairman this morning when he said Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not. But he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where volume 2 of this report puts him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Mueller, good morning. Your exchange with the gentlelady from California demonstrates what is at stake. The Trump campaign chair, Paul Manafort, was passing sensitive voter information and poll data to a Russian operative. And there were so many other ways that Russia subverted our democracy. Together with the evidence in Volume 1, I cannot think of a more serious need to investigate. So now I'm going to ask you some questions about obstruction of justice as it relates to Volume 2. On page 12 of Volume 2, you state, we determined that there were a sufficient factual and legal basis to further investigate potential obstruction of justice issues involving the president. Is that correct?
And do you have the citations, ma'am?
Page 12, Volume 2.
And which portion of that page?
That is, we determined that there was a sufficient factual and legal basis to further investigate potential obstruction of justice issues involving the president. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your report also describes at least 10 separate instances of possible obstruction of justice that were investigated by you and your team. Is that correct?
Yes.
In fact, the table of contents serves as a very good guide of some of the acts of that obstruction of justice that you investigated, and I put it up on the screen. On page 157 of Volume 2, you describe those acts, and they range from the president's effort to curtail the special counsel's investigation, the president's further efforts to have the attorney general take over the investigation, the president's orders Don McGahn to deny that the president tried to fire the special counsel, and many others. Is that correct?
Yes.
I direct you now to what you wrote, Director Mueller. The president's pattern of conduct as a whole sheds light on the nature of the president's acts and the inferences that can be drawn about his intent. Does that mean you have to investigate all of his conduct to ascertain true motive?
No.
And when you talk about the president's pattern of conduct that include the 10 possible acts of obstruction that you investigated, is that correct? When you talk about the president's pattern of conduct, that would include the 10 possible acts of obstruction that you investigated, correct?
I direct you to the report for how that is characterized.
Thank you. Let me go to the screen again. And for each of those 10 potential instances of obstruction of justice, you analyze 3 elements of the crime of obstruction of justice: an obstructive act, a nexus between the act and an official proceeding, and corrupt intent. Is that correct?
Yes.
You wrote on page 178, Volume 2 in your report about corrupt intent, actions by the president to end a criminal investigation into his own conduct to protect against personal embarrassment or legal liability would constitute a core example of corruptly motivated conduct. Is that correct?
Yes.
To the screen again, even with the evidence you did find, is it true, as you note on page 76 of Volume 2, that the evidence does indicate that a thorough FBI investigation would uncover facts about the campaign and the president personally that the president could have understood to be crimes or that would give rise to legal, personal, and political concerns?
I rely on the language of the report.
Is that relevant to potential obstruction of justice? Is that relevant to potential obstruction of justice?
Yes.
You further elaborate on page 157, obstruction of justice can be motivated by a desire to protect non-criminal personal interests, to protect against investigations where underlying criminal liability falls into a gray area, or to avoid personal embarrassment. Is that correct?
Yes.
I have on the screen.
Is that correct on the screen?
Can you repeat the question?
And they had the worst
Now that I
cover-up
have the,
ever.
Language on the screen.
Is it correct As you further elaborate, obstruction of justice can be motivated by a direct desire to protect non-criminal personal interests, to protect against investigations where underlying criminal liability falls into a gray area, or to avoid. Is that true? And is it true that the impact, pardon?
Thinking investigation's wrong doesn't exonerate you from obstruction of justice?
No, the last question was the language on the screen asking you if that's correct.
I didn't want them to investigate me. That's why I did it.
Yes.
I was trying to save everybody time.
Does the conviction of obstruction of justice result potentially in a lot of years of time in jail?
A lot of time.
Yes. Well, again, can you repeat the question just to make certain that I have it accurate?
Jesus
does
Christ,
obstruction of justice
what I love
warrant
about
a lot
whole
of time?
saga,
This guy's Columbo.
There's
convicted?
always
Yes.
like
Without the
mystiques built up, like who's Carter Page, and then
Right.
finally he comes out, he's just like, "Hi, everybody!" And now it's like Robert Mueller's a really serious guy. He's like, "I didn't hear that too good."
It reads, quote, "At the conclusion of the special counsel's work, he or she shall provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination's decisions reached by the special counsel." That correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when a regulation
You
uses the
literally
word
say
shall
okay.
provide, does it mean that the individual is in fact obligated to provide what's being demanded by the regulation or statute, meaning you don't have any wiggle room, right?
I'd have to look more closely at the statute.
I just read it to you. Okay. Now, volume 2, page 1, your report boldly states we
wrong
determined
with my
not to
voice?
make a traditional
Why are the Republicans
prosecutorial-
on this committee so
prosecutorial
much better
judgment.
than the ones on the Cohen
Is that
committee?
correct?
That's interesting.
trying to find
They're not
that
all a bunch of
citation.
jackasses. Like, Mr. Cohen, is it true you're a reality TV star and an asshole?
Director, could you speak
These
more
guys are
directly
actually
into the
crap.
microphone, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, it's volume 2, page
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Yes, volume 2, page 1, it said, we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment.
Yes.
That's right in the beginning. Now, since you decided under the OLC opinion that you couldn't prosecute a sitting president, meaning President Trump, why did we have all of this investigation of President Trump that the other side is talking about when you knew that you weren't going to prosecute him?
Well, you don't know where the investigation is going to lie, and the OLC opinion itself says that you can continue the investigation even though you are not going to indict the president.
Okay, well, if you're not going to indict the president, then you just continue fishing, and that's my observation. You know, sure you. My time is limited. Sure, you can indict other people, but you can't indict the sitting president, right?
That's true.
Okay. Now, there are 182 pages in raw evidentiary material, including hundreds of references to 302, which are interviews by the FBI, for individuals who've never been cross-examined and which did not comply with the special counsel's governing regulation to explain the prosecution or declination decisions reached, correct?
And where are you reading from on that?
I'm reading from my question.
Then could you repeat it?
Okay. You have 182 pages of raw evidentiary material with hundreds of references to 302s who were never been cross-examined and which didn't comply with the governing regulation to explain the prosecution or declination decisions reached.
This is one of those areas which I declined to discuss.
Okay, then
And would direct you to the report itself.
Okay. Well, I looked at the 182 pages of it. You know, let me switch gears. Mr. Shabbat and I were on this committee during the Clinton impeachment. Now, while I recognize that the independent counsel statute under which Kenneth Starr operated is different from the special counsel statute, he, in a number of occasions in his report, stated that the President Clinton's actions may have risen to impeachable conduct, recognizing that it is up to the House of Representatives to determine what conduct is impeachable. You never used the term raising to impeachable conduct for any of the 10 instances that the gentlewoman from Texas did. Is it true that there's nothing in volume 2 of the report that says that the president may have engaged in impeachable conduct?
Well, we have studiously kept in the center of our investigation our mandate, and our mandate does not go to other ways of addressing conduct. Our mandate goes to developing the report and turning the report into the Attorney General.
With due respect, it seems to me, that there are a couple of statements that you made, that said that this is not for me to decide, and the implication is that this is for this committee to decide. Now, you didn't use the word impeachable conduct like Starr did. There was no statute to prevent you from using the word impeachable conduct. And I go back to what Mr. Ratcliffe said, and that is that even the president is innocent until proven guilty. My time is up.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Tennessee.
You got to let Mueller answer
Mr.
these hanging questions as to why he didn't address it. And frankly, Mueller's got to answer this. He's going to come out of this looking like shit because
and I thank you.
He thought that he could get away with being this cute in that report. And you cannot create a vacuum because the Republicans will fill it.
Send you the report
it will be filled.
Where that is stated.
Well, there is a quote from page 78 of your report, volume 2, which reads, when Sessions told the president that a special counsel had been appointed, the president slumped back in his chair and said, quote, oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed, unquote.
I'm going to recuse
Did Attorney General Sessions tell you about that little talk?
I'm not.
Director, please speak into the microphone.
Oh, surely. My apologies. I am not certain of the person who originally copied that quote.
Okay, well, Sessions apparently said it, and one of his aides had it in his notes too, which I think you had, but that's become record. He wasn't pleased. He probably wasn't pleased with the special counsel, and particularly you, because of your outstanding reputation.
Correct.
Prior to your appointment, the Attorney General recused himself from the investigation because of his role in the 2016 campaign. Is that not correct?
Correct.
Recusal means the Attorney General could not be involved in the investigation. Is that correct?
That's the effect of recusal, yes.
And so instead, another Trump appointee, as you know Mr. Sessions was, Mr. Rosenstein became in charge of it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Wasn't Attorney General Sessions following the rules and professional advice of the Department of Justice ethics folks when he recused himself from the investigation?
Yes.
And yet the president repeatedly expressed his displeasure at Sessions' decision to follow those ethics rules to recuse himself from oversight of that investigation. Is that not correct?
That's accurate based on what is written in the report.
And the president's reaction to the recusal is noted in the report. Mr. Bannon recalled that the president was mad as Bannon had ever seen him, and he screamed at McGahn about how weak Sessions was. Do you recall that from the report?
That's in the report, yes.
Despite knowing that Attorney General Sessions was not supposed to be involved in the investigation, the president still tried to get the Attorney General to unrecuse himself after you were appointed special counsel. Is that correct?
Yes.
In fact, your investigation found that at some point after your appointment, quote, the president called Sessions at his home and asked if he would unrecuse himself. Is that not true?
It's true.
Now, that wasn't the first time the president had asked Sessions to unrecuse himself, was it?
I know there were at least 2 occasions.
And one of them was with Flynn, and one of them was when Sessions and McGahn flew to Mar-a-Lago to meet with the president. Sessions recalled that the president pulled him aside to speak alone and suggested he should do this unrecusal act. Correct?
Correct.
And then when Michael Flynn, a few days after Flynn entered a guilty plea for lying to federal agents and indicated his intent to cooperate with that investigation, Trump asked to speak to Sessions alone again in the Oval Office and again asked Sessions to unrecuse himself. True?
I refer you to the report for that.
Page 109, volume 2. Thank you, sir. Do you know of any point when the president personally expressed anger or frustrations at Sessions?
I'd have to pass on that.
Do you recall, and I think it's at page 78 of volume 2, the president told Sessions, you were supposed to protect me. You were supposed to protect me, or words to that effect.
Correct.
And is the Attorney General supposed to be the Attorney General of the United States of America or the consigliere for the President?
United States of America.
Thank you, sir. In fact, you wrote in your report that the President repeatedly sought to convince Sessions to unrecuse himself so Sessions could supervise the investigation in a way that would restrict its scope. Is that correct?
Rely on the report.
How could Sessions have restricted the scope of your investigation?
Well, I'm not going to speculate. If he, quite obviously, if he took over or was Attorney General, he would have greater latitude in his actions that would enable him to do things that otherwise he could not.
On page 113, you said the President believed that an unrecused Attorney General would play a protective role and could shield the President from the ongoing investigation. Regardless of all that, I want to thank you, Director Mueller, for your life of rectitude and service to our country. It's clear from your report and the evidence that the President wanted former Attorney General Sessions to violate the Justice Department ethics rules by taking over your investigation and improperly interfering with it to protect himself and his campaign. Your findings are so important because in America, nobody is above the law.
That seems obviously true to me.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back.
They're
The gentleman from
shoehorning
Ohio.
it after
Thank
he
you.
doesn't give
Director
clear
Mueller,
answers.
my Democratic colleagues were very disappointed in your report. They were expecting you to say something along the lines of, here's why President Trump deserves to be impeached, much as Ken Starr did relative to President Clinton back about 20 years ago. Well, you didn't. So their strategy had to change. Now they allege that there's plenty of evidence in your report to impeach the president, but the American people just didn't read it. And this hearing today is their last best hope to build up some sort of groundswell across America to impeach President Trump. That's what this is really all about today. Now, a few questions. On page 103 of Volume 2 of your report, when discussing the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting, you reference, quote, the firm that produced the Steele reporting, unquote. The name of that firm was Fusion GPS. Is that correct?
And you're on page 103?
103, that's correct, Volume 2.
Can you repeat that?
When you talk about the firm that produced the Steele reporting,
He may not have,
the name of the firm that produced that was Fusion GPS.
As I just signed off on this
I'm
shit.
not familiar with that.
Well, let me just help you. It's not a trick question, right? It was Fusion GPS. Now, Fusion GPS
It's not a trick question. That's coming next.
Document widely known as the Steele dossier, and the owner of Fusion GPA was someone named Glenn Simpson. Are you familiar with?
This is outside my purview.
Okay. Glenn Simpson was never mentioned in the 448-page Mueller report, was he?
Well, as I say, it's outside my purview, and it's being handled in the department by others.
Okay. Well, he was not. 448 pages.
It's amazing
the
how
owner
close
of
this
Fusion
is to the De
GPS,
Niro impression.
that did the Steele dossier, that started all this. He's not mentioned in there.
Let
me move on.
Bad.
At the same time, Fusion GPS was working to collect opposition research on Donald Trump from foreign sources on behalf of the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. It also was representing a Russian-based company, Prevazon, which had been sanctioned by the U.S. government. Are you aware of that?
It's outside my purview.
Okay, thank you. One of the key players I'll go to something different. One of the key players in the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting was Natalia Vizhnetska, who you described in your report as a Russian attorney who advocated for the repeal of the Magnitsky Act. Vizhnetska had been working with none other than Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS since at least early 2014. Are you aware of that?
Outside my purview.
Thank you. But you didn't mention that or her connections to Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS in
This
your
is
report
them
at all.
just going on with their
Let me
conconspiracy
move on.
theories and saying it
Now,
to them. And
NBC
literally, you
News
could
has
get up there
reported
and
the
talk
following.
about Pizzagate.
Quote, Russian lawyer
and do the exact
Natalia
same thing.
Vizhnetska says she first received the supposedly incriminating information she brought to Trump Tower describing alleged tax evasion and donation to Democrats from none other than Glenn Simpson, the Fusion GPS owner. You didn't include that in the report, and I assume you're saying that
This
would
is
be
the matter
outside.
being handled by others.
Were you aware that John Podesta was ordering
Now, your
pizza
report spends
and
14
and
pages
is celiac?
discussing the June 9th, 2016 Trump Tower meeting.
Did you know John
It would be fair
Podesta
to say, would
can't
it not, that you
metabolize
spent
cheese?
significant
Yet he's asking for
resources
cheese
investigating
pizza.
that
What
meeting?
do you make of that?
I refer you
Sorry,
to
can you repeat that?
the report.
Okay. And
The
President Trump
Pizzagate
wasn't
hearing
at
with
the
Robert
meeting.
Mueller.
Exactly.
Can you hear?
No,
Sorry, what was
Thank you.
outside of my
Now, in
purview?
stark contrast to the actions of the Trump
Are
campaign,
you familiar with the
we know
Bilderberger
that
Group?
The Clinton campaign did pay.
Sorry, can you
using
repeat that?
GPS
The
to
Bilderberger
gather
Group.
dirt on the Trump campaign.
That's
from
outside of
persons
my purview.
associated
Are you
with
familiar
foreign
with the
governments.
weather machine that
But your
Barack
report
Obama
doesn't
had,
mention a
and
thing
apparently
about Fusion GPS.
Yeah, I had heard of
building
the.
in his.
Fusion GPS's
That wasn't in my
connections to
mandate.
Russia. So let me just ask
Can you
this.
repeat that?
Can you see?
Well, I
that
did say
from
Fusion GPS is
neglecting
related to an
mention
ongoing
Glenn
matter,
Simpson
right?
and Fusion
Well,
GPS's
the
involvement with the Clinton
DOJ
campaign,
Inspector
focusing
General
on a brief
is,
meeting at the
according
Trump
to
Tower that
Bill
produced
Barr,
nothing,
is
to
investigating
ignoring the Clinton campaign's
investigating all
own
of this
ties
to see if
Fusion
they can come up with
GPS.
some type
Why
of
some
BS.
view your report as a pretty one-sided attack on the president?
Well, I tell you, this is still outside my purview.
All right, and I would just note finally that I guess it's just by chance, by coincidence, that the things left out of the report tended to be favorable to the president. My time's expired.
Wouldn't it be
Thank
great
you,
if De Niro actually did
Director
an
Muller. I'd
impression
like to
like
get us
this? and
back
just
on
like, "Can you
track
repeat
here.
that?"
Your investigation found that President Trump directed White House counsel Don McGahn to fire you. Isn't that correct?
True.
And the president claimed that he wanted to fire you because you had supposed conflicts of interest. Isn't that correct?
True.
Now, you had no conflicts of interest that required your removal. Isn't that a fact?
So correct.
And in fact, Don McGahn advised the president that the asserted conflicts were, in his words, silly and not real conflicts. Isn't that true?
I refer to the report on that episode.
Well, page 85 of volume 2 speaks to that. And also, Director Mueller, DOJ ethics officials confirmed that you had no conflicts that would prevent you from serving as special counsel. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
But despite Don McGahn and the Department of Justice guidance, around May 23rd, 2017, the president, quote, prodded McGahn to complain to Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein about these supposed conflicts of interest, correct?
Correct.
Can you repeat that?
And McGahn declined to call Rosenstein, telling the president that it would look like still trying to meddle in the investigation and knocking out Mueller would be another fact used to claim obstruction of justice. Isn't that correct?
Generally so, yes.
And in other words, Director Mueller, the White House counsel told the president that if he tried to remove you, that could be another basis to allege that the president was obstructing justice, correct?
That is generally correct, yes.
Now, I'd like to review what happened after the president was warned about obstructing justice. On Tuesday,
I'm sorry, Congressman, do you have a citation for the?
Yes, volume 2, page 81.
Thank you.
And 82. Now, I'd like to review what happened after the president was warned about obstructing justice. It's true that on Tuesday, June 13th, 2017, the president dictated a press statement stating he had, quote, no intention of firing you, correct?
Correct.
But the following day, June 14th, the media reported for the first time that you were investigating the president for obstructing of justice, correct?
Correct.
And then, after learning for the first time that he was under investigation, the very next day, the president, quote, issued a series of tweets acknowledging the existence of the obstruction investigation and criticizing it. Isn't that correct?
Generally so.
And then, on Saturday, June 17th, 2 days later, the president called Don McGahn at home from Camp David on a Saturday to talk about you. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
What was the significant What was significant about that first weekend phone call that Don McGahn took from President Trump?
Well, I'm going to ask you to rely on what we wrote about those incidents.
Well, you wrote in your report that on at page 85, volume 2, that on Saturday, June 17, 2017, the president called McGahn at home to have the special counsel removed. Now, did the president call Don McGahn more than once that day?
Well, I gave...
I think it was 2 calls.
Sorry about that.
On page 85 of your report, you wrote, quote, on the first call, McGahn recalled that the president said something like, quote, you got to do this, you got to call Rod, correct?
Correct.
And your investigation and report found that Don McGahn was perturbed, to use your words, by the president's request to call Rod Rosenstein to fire him. Isn't that correct?
Well, there was a continuous colloquy. There was a continuous involvement of Don McGahn in responding to the president's entreaties.
And he did not want to put himself in the middle of that. He did not want to have a role in asking the Attorney General to fire the special counsel, correct?
Well, I would again refer you to the report and the way it is characterized in the report.
Thank you. At volume 2, page 85, it states that he didn't want to have the Attorney General, he didn't want to have a role in trying to fire the Attorney General. So at this point, I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mueller, well, first, let me ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to submit this article, Robert Mueller Unmasked, for the record.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. Mueller, who wrote the 9-minute comments you read at your May 29th press conference?
I'm not going to get into that.
Okay, so that's what I thought. You didn't write it. A 2013 puff piece in the Washingtonian about Comey said basically when Comey called, you drop everything you were doing. It gave examples. You're having dinner with your wife and daughter. Comey calls, you drop everything and go. The article quoted Comey as saying, if a train were coming down the track, and I quote, at least Bob Mueller will be standing on the tracks with me. You and James Comey have been good friends or were good friends for many years, correct?
We were business associates. We both started off in the Justice Department about this
You were good friends. You can work together and not be friends, but you and Comey were friends.
We were friends.
We loved each other.
Thank you.
It was a love that was hard for us to explore.
Now, before you were appointed as special counsel, had you talked to James Comey in the preceding 6 months?
No.
When you were appointed as special counsel, was President Trump's firing of Comey something you anticipated investigating, potentially obstruction of justice?
I'm not going to get into that. That's internal deliberations in the Justice Department.
Actually, it goes to your credibility, and maybe you've been away from the courtroom for a while. Credibility is always relevant. It's always material, and that goes for you, too. You're a witness before us. Let me ask you, when you talked to President Trump the day before he appointed you, or you were appointed as special counsel, you were talking to him about FBI director position again. Did he mention the firing of James Comey?
Not as a candidate. I was asked.
Did he mention the firing of James Comey in your discussion with him?
Cannot remember.
Pardon?
Cannot remember. Don't believe so, but I'm not going to be specific.
You don't remember. But if he did, you could have been a fact witness as to the president's comments and state of mind on firing James Comey.
I suppose that's possible.
Yeah. So most prosecutors want to make sure there's no appearance of impropriety. But in your case, you hired a bunch of people that did not like the president. Let me ask you, when did you first learn of Peter Strzok's animus toward Donald Trump?
In the summer of 2017.
You didn't know before he was hired?
I'm sorry?
You didn't know before he was hired for your team?
Know what?
Peter Strzok hated Trump.
Okay.
You didn't know that before he was made part of your team. Is that what you're saying?
I did not know that.
All right. When did you first learn?
When we did find out, I acted swiftly to have him reassigned elsewhere in the FBI.
Well, there's some discussion about how swift that was, but when did you learn of the ongoing affair he was having with Lisa Page?
About the same time.
Okay.
When did you find out he was banging Lisa Page?
Did you ever order anybody
you
to
doddering old bastard?
The deletion of all of their texts off of their government phones?
Once we found that Peter Strzok was an author of...
did you ever...
What exploiting their sexuality and plotting against America, and you did nothing.
An investigation into the
you love James Comey like Brokeback Mountain.
Of their government phones?
No, there was an IG investigation ongoing.
Well, listen, regarding collusion or conspiracy, you didn't find evidence of any agreement, I'm quoting you, among the Trump campaign officials and any Russia-linked individuals to interfere with our U.S. election, correct?
Correct.
So you also note in the report that an element of any of those obstructions you referenced requires a corrupt state of mind, correct?
Corrupt intent, correct.
Right. And if somebody knows
State of Mind is a
they
good
did
album
not
title right
conspire with anybody from Russia to affect the election, and they see the big Justice Department with people that hate that person coming after them, and then a special counsel appointed who hires dozen or more people that hate that person, and he knows he's innocent. He's not corruptly acting in order to see that justice is done. What he's doing is not obstructing justice. He is pursuing justice, and the fact that you ran it out to
QAnon. QAnon. It's Louis Gomez.
Injustice.
I take your
Gentleman's
question.
time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I take your question.
What?
The gentleman from Florida.
Director Mueller.
What does that mean? I take your question.
Director Mueller, I'd like to get back to your findings covering June of 2017. There was a bombshell
Duly
article
noted.
that reported that the President of the United States was personally under investigation for obstruction of justice. And you said in your report on page 90, volume 2, and I quote, "News of the obstruction investigation prompted the President to call McGahn and seek to have the special counsel removed."
Mr. Mueller, when did you first
and then
give
in your
James
report, you wrote
Comey
about
a
multiple
bath
calls from the
massage?
President to White House counsel Don McGahn. And regarding the second call, you wrote, and I quote, "McGahn recalled that the President was more direct, saying something like, 'Call Rod. Tell Rod that Mueller has conflicts and can't be the special counsel.' McGahn recalled the President telling him, 'Mueller has to go, and call me back when you do it.'" Director Mueller, did McGahn understand what the President was ordering him to do?
I direct you to what we've written in the report in terms of characterizing his feelings.
And in the report it says, quote, "McGahn understood the President to be saying that the special counsel had to be removed." You also said on page 86 that, quote, "McGahn considered the President's request to be an inflection point, and he wanted to hit the brakes, and he felt trapped, and McGahn decided he had to resign." McGahn took action to prepare to resign, isn't that correct?
I direct you again to the report.
And in fact,
Is it
that
true
very
that
day he
Rod
went to the White House,
Rosenstein
and
hates
quoting your
Israel?
report, you said, quote, "He then drove to the office to pack his belongings and submit his resignation letter," close quote.
That is directly from the report.
It is. And before he resigned, however, he called the President's chief of staff, Reince Priebus, and he called the President's senior advisor, Steve Bannon. Do you recall what McGahn told them?
Whatever was said will appear in the report.
It is. And it says on page 87, quote, "Priebus recalled that McGahn said that the President asked him to do crazy expletive. In other words, crazy stuff. The White House counsel thought that the President's request was completely out of bounds.
You guys
said
are
the President
really
asked him to do
landing
something
it.
crazy. It was wrong. And he was prepared to resign over it. Now, these are extraordinarily troubling events, but you found White House counsel McGahn to be a credible witness, isn't that correct?
Correct.
Director Mueller, the most important question I have for you today is why? Director Mueller, why did the President of the United States want you fired?
I can't answer that question.
Well, on page 89,
because he's a
in your
secret
report,
Democrat
volume 2,
and a communist.
You said, and I quote, substantial evidence indicates that the President's attempts to remove the special counsel were linked to the special counsel's oversight of investigations that involve the President's conduct, and most immediately, to reports that the President was being investigated for potential obstruction of justice, close quote. Director Mueller, you found evidence, as you lay out in your report, that the President wanted to fire you because you were investigating him for obstruction of justice. Isn't that correct?
That's what it says in the report, yes. And I stand behind the report.
Director Mueller, that shouldn't happen in America. No president should be able to escape investigation by abusing his power. But that's what you testified to in your report. The President ordered you fired. The White House counsel knew it was wrong. The President knew it was wrong. In your report, it says there's also evidence the President knew he should not have made those calls to McGahn. But the President did it anyway. He did it anyway. Anyone else who blatantly interfered with a criminal investigation like yours would be arrested and indicted on charges of obstruction of justice. Director Mueller, you determined that you were barred from indicting a sitting president. We've already talked about that today. That is exactly why this committee must hold the President accountable. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Alabama.
Director Mueller, you just said in response to two different lines of questionings that you would refer, as it relates to this firing discussion, that I would refer you to the report in the way it was characterized in the report. Importantly, the President never said fire Mueller or in the investigation, and one doesn't necessitate the other. And McGahn, in fact, did not resign. He stuck around for a year and a half. On March 24th, Attorney General Barr informed the committee that he had received the special counsel's report, and it was not until April 18th that the Attorney General released the report to Congress and the public. When you submitted your report to the Attorney General, did you deliver a redacted version of the report so that he would be able to release it to Congress and the public without delay, pursuant to his announcement of his intention to do so during his confirmation hearing?
I'm not going to engage in discussion about what happened after the production of our report.
Had the Attorney General asked you to provide a redacted version of the report?
We worked on the redacted versions together.
Did he ask you for a version where the grand jury material was separated?
Not going to get into details.
Is it your belief that an unredacted version of the report could be released to Congress or the public?
That's not within my purview.
Did we just lose sound?
I think it's the feed sound. Yeah, there's something not wrong with C-SPAN.
Wow.
So.
Why did you not take a similar action so Congress could view this material?
We had a process that we were operating on with the Attorney General's office.
Are you aware of any Attorney General going to court to receive similar permission to unredact 6E material?
I'm not aware of that being done.
The Attorney General released the special counsel's report with minimal redactions to the public and an even lesser redacted version to Congress. Did you write the report with the expectation that it would be released publicly?
No, we did not have an expectation. We wrote the report understanding that it was demanded by the statute and would go to the Attorney General for further review.
And pursuant to the special counsel regulations, who is the only party that must receive the charging decision resulting from the special counsel's investigation?
With regard to the President or generally?
No, generally.
Attorney General?
At Attorney General Barr's confirmation hearing, he made it clear that he intended to release your report to the public. Do you remember how much of your report had been written at that point?
Do not.
Were there significant changes in tone or substance of the report made after the announcement that the report would be made available to Congress and the public?
I can't get into that.
During the Senate testimony of Attorney General William Barr, Senator Kamala Harris asked Mr. Barr if he had looked at all the underlying evidence that the special counsel's team had gathered. He stated that he had not. So I'm going to ask you, did you personally review all of the underlying evidence gathered in your investigation?
Well, to the extent that it came through the special counsel's office, yes.
Did any single member of your team review all the underlying evidence gathered during the course of your investigation?
As has been recited here today, a substantial amount of work was done, whether it be search warrants or
My point is there was no one member of the team that looked at everything.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, it's fair to say that in an investigation as comprehensive as yours, it's normal that different members of the team would have reviewed different sets of documents, and few, if anyone, would have reviewed all of the underlying.
Thank you, yes.
How many of the approximately 500 interviews conducted by the special conference did you attend personally?
Very few.
On March 27, 2019, you wrote a letter to the Attorney General essentially complaining about the media coverage of your report. You wrote, and I quote, "The summary letter the department sent to Congress and released to the public late in the afternoon of March 24 did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of this office work and conclusions. We communicated that concern to the department on the morning of March 25th. There is now public confusion about critical aspects of the result of our investigation." Who wrote that March 27th letter?
Well, I can't get into who wrote it, the internal deliberation.
But you signed it.
What I will say is the letter stands for itself.
Okay. Why did you write a formal letter since you had already called the Attorney General to express those concerns?
I can't get into that, internal deliberations.
Did you authorize the letters released to the media, or was it leaked?
I have no knowledge on either.
Well, you went nearly 2 years without a leak. Why was this letter leaked?
I can't get into it.
Was this letter written and leaked for the express purpose of attempting to change the narrative about the conclusions of your report? And was anything in Attorney General Barr's letter referred to as principal conclusions inaccurate?
The time of the gentlelady has expired.
Can he answer the question, please?
And the question is?
Yes, you may answer the question.
Was anything in Attorney General Barr's letter referred to as the principal conclusions letter dated March 24th inaccurate?
Well, I am not going to get into that.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Mueller, as you know, we are focusing on 5 obstruction episodes today. I would like to ask you about the second of those 5 obstruction episodes. It is in the section of your report, beginning on page 113 of Volume 2, entitled, quote, "The President orders McGahn to deny that the President tried to fire the special counsel," end quote. On January 25th, 2018, the New York Times reported that, quote, "The President had ordered McGahn to have the Department of Justice fire you." Is that correct?
Correct.
And that story related to the events you already testified about here today. The President's calls to McGahn to have you removed, correct?
Correct.
After the news broke, did the President go on TV and deny the story?
Do not know.
In fact, the President said, quote, "Fake news, folks, fake news, a typical New York Times fake story," end quote, correct?
Correct.
But your investigation actually found substantial evidence that McGahn was ordered by the President to fire you, correct?
Yes.
Did the President's personal lawyer do something the following day in response to that news report?
I'd refer you to the coverage of this in the report.
On page 114, quote, "On January 26, 2018, the President's personal counsel called McGahn's attorney and said that the President wanted McGahn to put out a statement denying that he had been asked to fire the special counsel," end quote. Did McGahn do what the President asked?
I refer you to the report.
Communicating through his personal attorney, McGahn refused because he said, quote, "that the Times story was accurate in reporting that the President wanted the special counsel removed." Isn't that right?
I believe it is, but I refer you again to the report.
Okay, so Mr. McGahn, through his personal attorney, told the President that he was not going to lie. Is that right?
True.
Did the President drop the issue?
I refer to the write-up of this in the report.
Okay, next, the president told the White House staff secretary, Rob Porter, to try to pressure McCann to make a false denial. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What did he actually direct Porter to do?
And I would send you back to the report.
Okay, well, on page 113, it says, quote, the president then directed Porter to tell McCann to create a record to make it clear that the president never directed McCann to fire you, end quote. Is that correct?
That is, as it's stated in the report.
And you found, quote, the president said he wanted McCann to write a letter to the file for our records, correct?
Correct.
And to be clear, the president is asking his White House counsel, Don McCann, to create a record that McCann believed to be untrue while you were in the midst of investigating the president for obstruction of justice, correct?
Generally correct.
And Mr. McCann was an important witness in that investigation, wasn't he?
I'd have to say yes.
Did the president tell Porter to threaten McCann if he didn't create the written denial?
I'd refer you to the write-up of it in the report.
In fact, didn't the president say, quote, and this is on page 116, if he doesn't write a letter, then maybe I'll have to get rid of him, end quote?
Yes.
Did Porter deliver that threat?
I again refer you to the discussion that's found on page 115.
Okay, but the president still didn't give up, did he? So the president told McCann directly to deny that the president told him to have you fired. Can you tell me exactly what happened?
I can't beyond what's in the report.
Well, on page 116, it says the president met him in the Oval Office. Quote, the president began the Oval Office meeting by telling McCann that the New York Times story didn't look good and McCann needed to correct it. Is that correct?
Correct. So, as it's written in the report, yes.
The president asked McCann whether he would do a correction, and McCann said no. Correct?
That's accurate.
Well, Mr. Mueller, thank you for your investigation uncovering this very disturbing evidence. My friend, Mr. Richmond, will have additional questions on the subject. However, it is clear to me if anyone else had ordered a witness to create a false record and cover up acts that are subject of a law enforcement investigation, that person would be facing criminal charges. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Director, the FBI interviewed Joseph Mifsud on February 10th, 2017. In that interview, Mr. Mifsud lied. You point this out on page 193, volume 1. Mifsud denied. Mifsud also falsely stated. In addition, Mifsud omitted. 3 times he lied to the FBI, yet you didn't charge him with the crime.
Excuse me.
What's going on?
Oh no. Guess we all have to go home and go back to bed.
Let's remember this. Let's remember this. In 2016, the FBI did something they probably haven't done before. They spied on 2 American citizens associated with a presidential campaign, George Papadopoulos and Carter Page. With Carter Page, they went to the FISA court. They used the now famous dossier as part of the reason they were able to get the warrant and spy on Carter Page for a better part of a year. With Mr. Papadopoulos, they didn't go to the court. They used human sources. All kinds of, from about the moment Papadopoulos joins the Trump campaign, you got all these people all around the world starting to swirl around him. Names like Halper, Downer, Mifsud, Thompson, meeting in Rome, London, all kinds of places. The FBI even sent a lady posing as somebody else, went by the name Azra Turk, even dispatched her to London to spy on Mr.
I didn't hear your
Papadopoulos.
question, but I would prosecute your wrestling
meetings,
program.
Mr. Papadopoulos is talking to a foreign diplomat, and he tells the diplomat, Russians have dirt on Clinton. That diplomat then contacts the FBI, and the FBI opens an investigation based on that fact. You point this out on page 1 of the report. July 31st, 2016, they open the investigation based on that piece of information. Diplomat tells Papadopoulos, Papadopoulos tells a diplomat, Russians have dirt on Clinton. Diplomat tells the FBI. What I'm wondering is, who told Papadopoulos? How'd he find out?
I can't get into the evidentiary
Yes, you can, because you wrote about it. You gave us the answer. Page 192 of the report, you tell us who told him. Joseph Mifsud. Joseph Mifsud's a guy who told Papadopoulos, the mysterious professor who lives in Rome and London, teaches in 2 different universities. This is the guy who told Papadopoulos. He's the guy who starts it all. And when the FBI interviews him, he lies 3 times, and yet you don't charge him with a crime. You charge Rick Gates for false statements. You charge Paul Manafort for false statements. You charge Michael Cohen with false statements. You charge Michael Flynn, a 3-star general, with false statements. But the guy who puts the country through this whole saga, starts it all for 3 years we've lived this now, he lies, and you guys don't charge him. And I'm curious as to why.
Well, we can't get into it, and it's obvious, I think, that we can't get into charging decisions.
When the FBI interviewed him in February, FBI interviews him in February, when the special counsel's office interviewed Mifsud, did he lie to you guys too?
Can't get into that.
Did you interview Mifsud?
Can't get into that.
Is Mifsud Western intelligence or Russian intelligence?
Can't get into that.
A lot of things you can't get into. What's interesting, you can charge 13 Russians no one's ever heard of, no one's ever seen, no one's ever going to hear of them, no one's ever going to see them. You can charge them. You can charge all kinds of people who are around the president with false statements. But the guy who launches the guy who puts this whole story in motion, you can't charge him. I think that's amazing.
I'm not certain I agree with your characterization.
I'm reading from your report. Mifsud told Papadopoulos. Papadopoulos tells the diplomat tells the FBI opens the investigation July 31st, 2016, and here we are 3 years later, July of 2019, the country's been put through this, and the central figure who launches it all lies to us, and you guys don't hunt him down and interview him again, and you don't charge him with a crime. Now here's the good news. Here's the good news. The president was falsely accused of conspiracy. The FBI does a 10-month investigation, and James Comey, when we deposed him a year ago, told us at that point they had nothing. You do a 22-month investigation. At the end of that 22 months, you find no conspiracy. And what's the Democrats want to do? They want to keep investigating. They want to keep going. Maybe a better course of action is to figure out how the false accusation started. Maybe it's to go back and actually figure out why Joseph Mifsud was lying to the FBI. And here's the good news. Here's the good news. That's exactly what Bill Barr's doing. And thank goodness for that. That's exactly what the Attorney General and John Durham are doing. They're going to find out why we went through this three-year saga and get to the bottom of it.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Theory that
in a moment we will take a very brief 5-minute break.
Operation.
First, I ask everyone in the room to please remain seated and quiet.
And I got to be honest,
while the witness exits the room. I also want to announce to those in the audience that you may not be guaranteed your seat if you leave the hearing room at this time.
There's so much redacted from the report. That's what I found frustrating about reading it.
It's so annoying, especially when you're listening to it. I tried to start listening to more of it and every other word.
Short recess.
I thought Nadler's exchange was the most effective politically in terms of like all of this so far. That they will use that up front. I mean, you know, we can go through the sort of minutia of the obstruction when he's talking about firing McGahn and whatnot, but they should continue. For some reason, they've been avoiding the first chapter in terms of the question of collusion. And I think there's still plenty for them to just reading in the report, talking about the actions of the president while not specifically coordinated as to getting involved in the hacking, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly the idea of like, we'll do this, knowing you like it. You continue to do stuff that you know we like. And the report specifically says that is not chargeable. There is no crime committed there. in terms of the statute, but I would imagine it's certainly behavior that warrants impeachment. But the problem the Democrats have is that the leadership of the Democratic Party does not want to impeach. And so there are narrow constraints on Nadler and the Democrats more broadly as to what they can pursue at this point. And we now have a challenger to Jerry Nadler, who is running, at least in part, on pushing Nadler to impeachment. And that's going to force Nadler to basically go to Nancy Pelosi and say, you know, if he perceives this challenge to be valid, I've got a challenger now. I've got to move forward more. So we'll see what happens with that. We should also say that this guy here, not Gates, but the other one, who
right?
Who is that?
Was it Ratcliffe?
Yeah, Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe just met with the president as a possible replacement for Dan Coates at the Director of National Intelligence. So
gotta say, looking pretty good.
You did a good job out there.
We need to abolish the intelligence services.
I agree. They're incompatible with democracy. But I don't know. I am increasingly interested in the idea of this stuff originating as some type of intelligence operation against Trump. And again, that's not exculpatory of Trump, right? Like, you could still have the same conclusions about Trump, but the origins of where it came from and how this is played out are significant. I don't know. I think if they want to get at Trump, it just needs
the CIA at that point in when they supposedly, right? So if Misfud was a CIA asset,
which has been,
well, it's not inconceivable that this is a guy who works for both
precisely
sides. Most of these people,
a lot of people like
tend
to
do that.
Right.
Why would he know from the CIA that the Russians had this material that was damaging on Hillary Clinton?
I don't know.
I mean, isn't it more likely that the Russians knew that the Russians had the material?
I guess we're talking when we say the Russians material, that means WikiLeaks? Is that what the assumption is?
No, the hack was done by
the Guccifer.
Well, yeah, GRU.
Right.
So, I mean, why is it more likely that the CIA?
I have no idea. I'm curious. I'm interested in how this
would
is
know
facilitated
this
to Trump.
Well,
I mean, the intelligence estimates of like Russian interference in this election have gone back to during the election. That's definitely not inconceivable. They would know that at all.
Well,
but
I understand what you mean about the straightest path, but saying it's unlikely or inconceivable, they would have a sense of it.
Would the theory then be that
course they
like
would
Jim
have it.
Jordan is, for instance, bluffing and saying that we're gonna figure out what this is, knowing full well that ultimately you're just going to get like
of course. Were you aware of the Benghazi hearings?
Right. It's just going to be the national security response, like, oh, we can't go in.
Right.
Of course.
Go into it.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's conceivable, but the fact is that Misfud if Misfud is either a Russian asset or a Russian asset and a CIA asset or a CIA asset, one of those three things, right? Mm-hmm. But in any scenario, what is the most likely way that he would know that the Russians were the ones who were behind the hack at that point?
No idea. I don't know.
Well,
I understand
that he knew this from the Russians.
Sure.
Right. I mean, it's just the most obvious answer. It's conceivable that the
there's a lot
CIA
of
knew
things
that
that
the
are
Russians had done the hack within
and then wanted
weeks.
to test the Trump administration.
Exactly.
Weeks.
Exactly.
But,
and there is a reason that all this stuff has been constantly fed by these people, which would kind of correlate with that. I don't know. I just think in terms of taking shots at Trump, it needs to be like, I just don't think the average person is interested in like, and when did he say that about Sessions? And then he called Sessions a jerk.
Well, that's what I was saying about the obstruction. It's a little bit too weedy.
Christ, look, if the Democratic Party had integrity and even just strategic tenacity, they would just come out and basically say, like, we're either starting the emoluments clause, and here's a super simple example of it, or this guy is mentally incompetent and racist, and
or just start a website with a big long list.
You just start. I mean, but it's like the idea that in 2019, with everything swirling around, like this is part of them being in a very tiny sub pocket of people that are actually like gonna go to shut down, early open bars in D.C. to be like, oh, whoa, but that was when Trump said that to McGahn the day before.
Well, I think they're getting too legalistic and they're not looking at it.
To say the least. It's the worst of both worlds because they're not going through with just like what they could do is just like, we're just gonna fucking impeach him because F him.
There's no magic words that are going to come out of this where the Democrats are all going to lock into impeachment.
And then all they do is just get into
the idea is
obscure minutia.
Yes, the idea should be that they're getting into this. That they're basically making people understand the broad scope of the report.
I think we can agree that that's not.
Like I say, Nadler, I think, is the only one so far who's got it.
And the problem is all this redaction and intelligence stuff, because ultimately the Republicans just kick it into that area, and people get confused by it.
I also think, just on a political level, another big advantage that Trump has is, I think that everybody, from the people who absolutely loathe him and will vote against him no matter what, to the people who love him, and even I would say to the people who are like weirdly undecided, I think the idea that Trump is some sort of criminal is maybe news to Jesse Lee Peterson. It's like, yeah, Trump obstructed justice. And I got to tell you, I think a lot of people would assume that, especially as it gets less and less like elaborate and sexy, but just like the idea that like, oh, maybe there's dirty dealings in campaigns and people try to cover that up. I don't think that brings out the smelling salts for most people.
No, hasn't he like bragged in the past about knowing guys in the mafia and stuff like that? Like
all the time,
he had a guy who was brand.
He had a guy who was mafia associated at one of his first public
Joey
events.
No Socks, baby.
Joey No Socks was chilling with him.
You want to open the champagne, Joey?
President. I mean, I almost feel like I just think you could go in one of two directions. One is emoluments, and he's an unhinged racist, so we're just going to take it to him. Or two, Democrats should start saying like, okay, European Union, if you're listening and you have a P-tape, we would like very much to see that. Like, let's just do this.
The committee's also failing, I think, in terms of like, they just don't have a grasp on this stuff enough. So, for instance, why wouldn't you charge Misfud in this report for lying to the FBI? Maybe it's because he's not in the purview of the investigation because he's not in any way associated
with.
He's
an American intelligence asset.
It's possible, but it also could be that he's not a person who's associated with the Trump campaign or the.
He is though, right?
No, Misfud is not.
I think, Mueller's been pretty willing to throw charges at people who are even Papadopoulos at the end of the day.
Papadopoulos was working.
I understand
for
he's a part of the Trump campaign. Essentially, he's a coffee boy.
There's also a concurrent intelligence investigation, and Misfud may have more relevance to that investigation than the criminal investigation of either obstruction or.
This is kind of the problem with.
If they can even find him. This guy is actually.
Well, now they can't find him.
Well, this whole intelligence thing. This is the original problem with when Hillary was on stage saying 16 different agencies has said Trump is associated with colluded with Russia, whatever she actually said. Is people are like, what? So what? 16 agencies that I don't have any sort of accountability to me,
and I shouldn't trust.
Exactly.
By the way, they've lied about the most or at the very least gotten wrong the most significant things of our time and clearly have their own agendas.
And so if there's all these other investigations impinging on this one that allow us to not really see the juiciest bits about this, are we ever going to hear about those investigations too? Probably not if they're intelligence investigations.
Right. I mean, it just seems like it just always goes back to what we've been saying from the beginning, which is like, yeah, there's they were sketchy, some stuff there. And I agree. I think Nadler is the only person that has gotten him to say anything that is clippable, frankly.
Who determines the degree of redaction?
That's that's Bill Barr.
Good luck with that.
The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
That's why I get pissed off on the other side of this equation. Oh yeah, well,
Thank you, Mr.
you really think Bill Barr would lie?
Mr. Mueller, Congressman Dutch addressed Trump's request to McGahn to fire you. Representative Bass talked about the president's request of McGahn to deny the fact that the president made that request. So I want to pick up where they left off, and I want to pick up with the president's personal lawyer. In fact, there was evidence that the president's personal lawyer was alarmed at the prospect of the president meeting with Mr. McGahn to discuss Mr. McGahn's refusal to deny the New York Times report about the president trying to fire you, correct?
Correct.
In fact, the president's counsel was so alarmed by the prospect of the president's meeting with McGahn that he called Mr. McGahn's counsel and said that McGahn could not resign no matter what happened in the Oval Office that day, correct?
Correct.
So it's accurate to say that the president knew that he was asking McGahn to deny facts that McGahn, quote, had repeatedly said were accurate, unquote. Isn't that right?
Correct.
Your investigation also found, quote, by the time of the Oval Office meeting with the president was aware, one, that McGahn did not think the story was false, two, did not want to issue a statement or create a written record denying facts that McGahn believed to be true. The president nevertheless persisted and asked McGahn to repudiate facts that McGahn had repeatedly said were accurate. Isn't that correct?
Generally true.
I believe that's on page 119. Thank you. In other words, the president was trying to force McGahn to say something that McGahn did not believe to be true.
That's accurate.
I want to reference you to a slide, and it's on page 120. And it says, substantial evidence indicates that in repeatedly urging McGahn to dispute that he was ordered to have the special counsel terminated, the president acted for the purpose of influencing McGahn's account in order to deflect or prevent further scrutiny of the president's conduct towards the investigation.
It's accurate.
Can you explain what you meant there?
I'm just going to leave it as it appears in the report.
So it's fair to say the president tried to protect himself.
Now Mueller realizes that's all he has to say every time.
Ongoing investigation.
I would say that's generally a summary.
I mean, I don't understand why they can't say why they can't. This is really frustrating. Like they're literally, the Democrats are literally making this as completely undramatic as they possibly can.
That episode.
Thank you. Also, the president's attempt to get McGahn to create a false written record related to Mr. Trump's concerns.
All you need to do is just focus on
inquiry, correct?
Is it fair to say, based upon your report, that the president told Don McGahn, his lawyer, to lie? Lied to you, lied to everybody. Yes, that's what the report says. So that is what it says. The president has told people to lie in front of an investigation. And here we are, and you're defending this? I mean, that's what's got to be going on, instead of like these... And then 15 minutes later, didn't Don McGahn say that the coffee is warm?
Right.
And if the coffee was warm, therefore it had to have been 20 minutes later, in which case the coffee was actually tepid.
Can you repeat that?
In other words,
Yeah, people are always saying the Democrats are sort of empty posturing or style over substance, but let's be fair, they don't have style either.
Again, go back
Indeed.
to the text of the.
It's not just that we don't have any electoral.
They're
Well, let me
they're
go a
just
little
like
bit further.
traumatized
Would it have been a
wussbags.
crime if Mr.
I mean, I don't.
McGahn had
That's
lied
the
to
only
you
thing.
about
I was
the
talking to
president
Crystal Ball about this
ordering
last
him
night.
to
Like,
fire you?
there's the ideological,
Okay.
global
Is it true that
economic
you charged
patterns that
multiple
change
people
center-left
associated
parties. There's
with
all
the
these big
president for
picture
lying
things,
to
and
you
then there's
during
also
your
just like,
investigation?
That is accurate.
how did this culture of
The president also
wussbaggery get
complained
created with these people?
that his
It's
staff were
incredible. Like,
taking notes,
Tony Blair's not a wussbag.
during the meeting
Bill Clinton's
about
not a wussbag.
firing
Barack Obama,
McGahn. Is that correct?
not when he was campaigning.
That's what the report says.
To give credit where credit's due, Hillary Clinton, not a wussbag.
But in fact, it's completely appropriate for the
She was on the
president's
border.
staff, especially his counsels, to take notes during a meeting, correct?
Well, I rely on the wording of the report.
Well, thank you, Director Mueller, for your investigation into whether the president attempted to obstruct justice by ordering his White House counsel, Don McGahn, to lie to protect the president and then to create a false record about it. It is clear that any other person who engaged in such
Imagine an
conduct
old lady
would be
looking at
charged
this
with a
congressman
crime.
right now being
We will
like,
continue our
"Thank you, young
investigation and we will
man.
hold the president
I don't know
accountable
who Don
because
McGahn
no one is above the
but
law."
I'm sure you're very upset. Thank you.
The gentleman from Florida.
I gotta go.
Director Mueller, can you state with confidence that the Steele dossier was not part of Russia's disinformation campaign?
No, as I said in my opening statement, that part of the building of the case predated me, and by at least 10 months.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Manafort's alleged crimes regarding tax evasion predated you. You had no problem charging them. And matter of fact, this Steele dossier predated the Attorney General, and he didn't have any problem answering the question. When Senator Cornyn asked the Attorney General the exact question I asked you, Director, the Attorney General said, and I'm quoting, "No, I can't state that with confidence." And that's one of the areas I'm reviewing. I'm concerned about it, and I don't think it's entirely speculative. Now, if something is not entirely speculative, then it must have some factual basis, but you identify no factual basis regarding the dossier or the possibility that it was part of the Russia disinformation campaign. Now, Christopher Steele's reporting is referenced in your report. Steele reported to the FBI that senior Russian foreign ministry figures, along with other Russians, told him that there was, and I'm quoting from the Steele dossier, extensive evidence of conspiracy between the Trump campaign team and the Kremlin. So here's my question. Did Russians really tell that to Christopher Steele, or did he just make it all up and was he lying to the FBI?
Let me back up a second, if I could, and say, as I said earlier, with regard to the Steele, that's beyond my purview.
No, it is exactly your purview, Director Mueller, and here's why. Only one of two things is possible, right? Either Steele made this whole thing up and there were never any Russians telling him of this vast criminal conspiracy that you didn't find, or Russians lied to Steele. Now, if Russians were lying to Steele to undermine our confidence in our duly elected president, that would seem to be precisely your purview, because you stated in your opening that the organizing principle was to fully and thoroughly investigate Russia's interference. But you weren't interested in whether or not Russians were interfering through Christopher Steele. And if Steele was lying, then you should have charged him with lying like you charged a variety of other people, but you say nothing about this in your report.
Well, sir.
Meanwhile, Director, you're quite loquacious on other topics. You write 3,500 words about the June 9 meeting between the Trump campaign and Russian lawyer Veselnitskaya. You write on page 103 of your report that the president's legal team suggested, and I'm quoting from your report, that the meeting might have been a setup by individuals working with the firm that produced the Steele reporting. So I'm going to ask you a very easy question, Director Mueller. On the week of June 9, who did Russian lawyer Veselnitskaya meet with more frequently? The Trump campaign or Glenn Simpson, who was functionally acting as an operative for the Democratic National Committee?
Well, what I think is missing here is the fact that this is under investigation elsewhere in the Justice Department. And if I can finish, sir, and consequently, it's not within my purview. Department of Justice and FBI should be responsive to questions on this particular issue.
It is absurd to suggest that a operative for the Democrats was meeting with this Russian lawyer the day before and the day after the Trump Tower meeting, and yet that's not something you referenced. Now, Glenn Simpson testified under oath. He had dinner with Veselnitskaya the day before and the day after this meeting with the Trump team. Do you have any basis, as you sit here today, to believe that Steele was lying?
As I said before, and I'll say again, it's not my purview. Others are investigating what you
So it's not your
addressed.
purview to look into whether or not Steele's lying. It's not your purview to look into whether or not anti-Trump Russians are lying to Steele. And it's not your purview to look at whether or not Glenn Simpson was meeting with the Russians the day before and the day after you write 3,500 words about the Trump campaign meeting. So I'm wondering how these decisions are guided. I look at the Inspector General's report. I'm citing from page 404 of the Inspector General's report. It states, Page stated, Trump's not ever going to be president, right? Right. Strzok replied, no, he's not. We'll stop it. Also in the Inspector General's report, there's someone identified as attorney number 2. Attorney number 2, this is page 419, replied, hell no, and then added, viva la resistance. Attorney number 2 in the Inspector General's report and Strzok both worked on your team, didn't they?
Pardon me? Can you ask?
They both worked on your team, didn't they?
I know. I heard Strzok. Who else were you talking about?
Attorney number 2 identified in the
I'm going
Inspector
to start
General's
answering
report.
questions like this.
Okay. And the question was?
Did he work for you? The guy who said viva la resistance.
Peter Strzok worked for me for a period of time, yes.
Yeah, but so did the other guy that said viva la resistance. And here's what I'm kind of noticing, Director Mueller. When people associated with Trump lied, you threw the book at him. When Christopher Steele lied, nothing. And so it seems to be that when Glenn Simpson met with Russians, nothing. When the Trump campaign met with Russians, 3,500 words. And maybe the reason why there are this discrepancies in what you focused on is because the team was so biased.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Man, Matt Guest is such a spaz.
New York is recognized.
I think the
Mueller,
Trump side
obstruction
is
of
winning.
justice is a
They
serious
are definitely
crime that
winning.
strikes at the core of an investigator's effort to find the truth, correct?
Correct.
The crime of obstruction of justice has 3 elements, true?
True.
The first element is an obstructive act, correct?
Correct.
An obstructive act could include taking an action that would delay or interfere with an ongoing investigation as set forth in Volume 2, page 87 and 88 of your report, true?
I'm sorry, could you again repeat the question?
An obstructive act could include taking an action that would delay or interfere with an ongoing investigation.
That's true.
Your investigation found evidence that President Trump took steps to terminate the special counsel, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Mueller, does ordering the termination of the head of a criminal investigation constitute an obstructive act?
That would be.
Let me refer
you to the report.
Let me refer you to page 87 and 88 of Volume 2, where you conclude the attempt to remove the special counsel would qualify as an obstructive act if it would naturally obstruct the investigation and any grand jury proceedings that might flow from the inquiry, correct?
Yes, I've got that now. Thank you.
Thank you. The second element of obstruction of justice is the presence of an obstructive act in connection with an official proceeding. True?
True.
Does the special counsel's criminal investigation into the potential wrongdoing of Donald Trump constitute an official proceeding?
And that's an area which I cannot get into.
What?
Okay. President Trump tweeted on June 16th, 2017, quote, I am being investigated for firing the FBI director by the man who told me to fire the FBI director, witch hunt. The June 16th tweet just read was cited on page 89 in Volume 2, constitutes a public acknowledgement by President Trump that he was under criminal investigation, correct?
I think generally correct.
One day later, on Saturday, June 17th, President Trump called White House counsel Don McGahn at home and directed him to fire the special counsel. True?
I believe it to be true. I think I may have stated in response to questions some.
That is correct. President Trump told Don McGahn, quote, Mueller has to go, close quote. Correct?
Correct.
Your report found on page 89, Volume 2, that substantial evidence indicates that by June 17th, the president knew his conduct was under investigation by a federal prosecutor who could present any evidence of federal crimes to a grand jury. True?
True.
The third element, second element having just been satisfied, the third element of the crime of obstruction of justice is corrupt intent. True?
True.
Corrupt intent exists if the president acted to obstruct an official proceeding for the improper purpose of protecting his own interests, correct?
That's generally correct.
Thank you.
The only thing I would say is we are going through the 3 elements of of the proof of the obstruction of justice charges, when the fact of the matter is we got. Excuse me, just 1 second.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mueller. Let me move on in the interest of time. Upon learning about the appointment of the special counsel, your investigation found that Donald Trump stated to the then Attorney General, quote, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed." Is that correct?
Correct.
Is it fair to say that Donald Trump viewed the special counsel's investigation into his conduct as adverse to his own interests?
I think that generally is true.
The investigation found evidence, quote, that the president knew that he should not have directed Don McGahn to fire the special counsel, correct?
And where do you have that quote?
Page 90, volume 2. There's evidence that the president knew he should not have made those calls to McGahn, close quote.
I see that, yes, that's accurate.
The investigation also found substantial evidence that President Trump repeatedly urged McGahn to dispute that he was ordered to have the special counsel terminated, correct?
Correct.
The investigation found substantial
Did
evidence.
these guys even talk
that when
to
the
each other
president ordered
beforehand?
Don McGahn to
Or did
fire
they,
I was
the
just
special
thinking that.
counsel
did they
and
say
then
like,
lie about it,
let's all do the
Donald
exact
Trump,
same
one,
line of questioning and
committed
see
an
which one of us
obstructive
does it more
act. Two,
clearly?
connected
Hakeem
to an
Jeffries
official
was like, I'm
proceeding.
subtweeting
did so with corrupt
Ilhan Omar. I
intent.
don't have time
Those
to really
are the
prep for
elements
this.
of obstruction of justice. This is the United States
No,
of
he was
America. No
subtweeting
one is
AOC
above
staff, actually.
the law.
Right.
No
I have
one.
to say, 99% of the
President
time
must
with
be
these
held
things, I say
accountable
it really just
one
doesn't
way
matter.
or
And
the
I'm
other.
legitimately
let
getting
me just
scared
say,
to the
if I
extent
might,
that this
I
one
don't
might
subscribe
matter.
necessarily to
It's
your,
a net gain for Republicans. This
the way
is
you analyze
really
that.
bad.
I'm not saying it's out of the ballpark, but I'm not supportive of that analytical charge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mueller over here.
Hi.
Hi. I want to start by thanking you for your service. You joined the Marines and led a rifle platoon in Vietnam, where you earned a Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and other commendations. You served as an assistant United States attorney leading the homicide unit here in D.C., U.S. attorney for the District of Massachusetts and later Northern District of California, assistant attorney general for DOJ's criminal division, and the FBI director. So thank you. I appreciate that. But having reviewed your biography, it puzzles me why you handled your duties in this case the way you did. The report contradicts what you taught young attorneys at the Department of Justice, including to ensure that every defendant is treated fairly, or as Justice Sutherland said in the Berger case, a prosecutor is not the representative of an ordinary party to a controversy, but of a sovereignty, whose interest in a criminal prosecution is not that it shall win a case, but that justice shall be done, and that the prosecutor may strike hard blows, but he is not at liberty to strike foul ones. By listing the 10 factual situations and not reaching a conclusion about the merits of the case, you unfairly shifted the burden of proof to the president, forcing him to prove his innocence while denying him a legal forum to do so. And I've never heard of a prosecutor declining a case and then holding a press conference to talk about the defendant. You noted 8 times in your report that you had a legal duty under the regulations to either prosecute or decline charges. Despite this, you disregarded that duty. As a former prosecutor, I'm also troubled with your legal analysis. You discussed 10 separate factual patterns involving alleged obstruction, and then you failed to separately apply the elements of the applicable statutes. I looked at the 10 factual situations, and I read the case law. And I have to tell you, just looking at the Flynn matter, for example, the 4 statutes that you cited for possible obstruction, 1503, 1505, 1512b3, and 1512c2. When I look at those concerning the Flynn matter, 1503 is inapplicable because there wasn't a grand jury or trial jury impaneled, and Director Comey was not an officer of the court as defined by the statute. Section 1505 criminalizes acts that would obstruct or impede administrative proceedings as those before Congress or an administrative agency. The Department of Justice Criminal Resource Manual states that the FBI investigation is not a pending proceeding. 1512b3 talks about intimidation, threats of force to tamper with a witness. General Flynn at the time was not a witness, and certainly Director Comey was not a witness. And 1512c2 talks about tampering with a record, and as Joe Biden described the statute as being debated on the Senate floor,
He called this a statute criminalizing document shredding, and there's nothing in your report that alleges that the president destroyed any evidence. So what I have to ask you, and what I think people are working around in this hearing is, let me lay a little foundation for it. The ethical rules require that a prosecutor have a reasonable probability of conviction to bring a charge. Is that correct?
Sounds generally accurate.
Okay. And the regulations concerning your job as special counsel state that your job is to provide the Attorney General with a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions reached by your office. You recommended declining prosecution of President Trump and anyone associated with his campaign because there was insufficient evidence to convict for a charge of conspiracy with Russian interference in the 2016 election. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Was there sufficient evidence to convict President Trump or anyone else with obstruction of justice?
We did not make that calculation.
How could you not have made the calculation with
Because
the regulation?
the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel, indicates that we cannot indict a sitting president. So one of the tools that a prosecutor would use is not there.
Okay, but let me just stop. You made the decision on the Russian interference. You couldn't have indicted the president on that, and you made the decision on that. But when it came to obstruction, you threw a bunch of stuff up against the wall to see what would stick.
Well,
and that is fundamentally unfair.
I would not agree to that characterization at all. What we did is provide to the Attorney General in the form of a confidential memorandum our understanding of the case. Those cases that were brought, those cases were declined, and that one case where the president cannot be charged with a crime.
Okay, but could you charge the president with a crime after he left office?
Yes.
You believe that you could charge the president of the United States with obstruction of justice after he left office?
Yes.
Ethically, under the ethical standards?
Well, I'm not certain because I haven't looked at the ethical standards, but the OLC opinion says that the prosecutor, while he cannot bring a charge against the sitting president, nonetheless, he can continue the investigation to see if there are any other persons who might be drawn into the conspiracy.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island.
Director, as you know, we are specifically focusing on 5 separate obstruction episodes here today. I'd like to ask you about the third episode.
I probably should have stopped on that before that last question.
The President's efforts to curtail the special counsel investigation, beginning at page 90.
Oh, Jesus, again?
You mean limit, correct?
Did these guys only read 3 pages of the report?
I would like to go back to
page 90.
Refused the order. The President asked others to help limit your investigation. Is that correct?
Correct.
And was Corey Lewandowski one such individual?
And again, can you remind me what character?
Corey
Lewandowski, the dim-witted fellow from New Hampshire.
Did he have any official position in the Trump administration?
I don't believe so.
Your report describes an incident in the Oval Office involving Mr. Lewandowski on June 19, 2017, at volume 2, page 91. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, what's the citation, sir?
Page 91.
Of the second volume?
Yes.
And
a meeting in the Oval Office between Mr. Lewandowski and the president.
Okay.
And that was just 2 days after the president called Don McGahn at home and ordered him to fire you. Is that correct?
Apparently so.
So right after his White House counsel, Mr. McGahn, refused to follow the president's order to fire you, the president came up with a new plan. And that was to go around all of his senior advisors and government aides to have a private citizen try to limit your investigation. What did the president tell Mr. Lewandowski to do? Do you recall he dictated a message to Mr. Lewandowski for Attorney General Sessions and asked him to write it down? Is that correct?
True.
And did you and your team see this handwritten message?
I'm not going to get into what we may or may not have included in our investigation.
Okay, the message directed Sessions to give, and I'm quoting from your report, to give a public speech saying that he planned to meet with the special prosecutor to explain this is very unfair and let the special prosecutor move forward with investigating election meddling for future elections. That's at page 91. Is that correct?
Yes, I see that. Thank you. Yes, it is.
In other words, Mr. Lewandowski, a private citizen, was instructed by the President of the United States to deliver a message from the President to the Attorney General that directed him to limit your investigation, correct?
Correct.
And at this time, Mr. Sessions was still recused from oversight of your investigation, correct?
I'm sorry, could you restate?
The Attorney General was recused from oversight.
Yes.
So the Attorney General would have had to violate his own department's rules in order to comply with the President's order, correct?
Well, I'm not going to get into the subsidiary details. I just refer you again to page 91, 92 of the report.
And if the Attorney General had followed through with the President's request, Mr. Mueller, it would have effectively ended your investigation into the President and his campaign, as you note on page 97, correct?
Could you...
At page 97, you write, and I quote, taken together, the President's directives indicate that Sessions was being instructed to tell the special counsel to end the existing investigation into the President and his campaign, with the special counsel being permitted to move forward with investigating election meddling for future elections. Is that correct?
Generally true. Yes, sir.
And it's an unsuccessful attempt to obstruct justice is still a crime. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And Mr. Lewandowski tried to meet with the Attorney General. Is that right?
True.
And he tried to meet with them in his office so he would be certain there wasn't a public log of the visit.
According to what we gathered for the report.
And the meeting never happened, and the President raised the issue again with Mr. Lewandowski, and this time he said, and I quote, if Sessions does not meet with you, Lewandowski should tell Sessions he was fired. Correct?
Correct.
So immediately following the meeting with the President, Lewandowski then asked Mr. Dearborn to deliver the message, who's the former Chief of Staff to Mr. Sessions, and Mr. Dearborn refuses to deliver it because he doesn't feel comfortable. Isn't that correct?
Generally correct, yes.
So just so we're clear, Mr. Mueller, 2 days after the White House counsel Don McGahn refused to carry out the President's order to fire you, the President directed a private citizen to tell the Attorney General of the United States, who was recused at the time, to limit your investigation to future elections, effectively ending your investigation into the 2016 Trump campaign. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not going to adopt your characterization. I'll say that the facts as laid out in the report are accurate.
Well, Mr. Mueller, in your report, you in fact write at page 97, substantial evidence indicates that the President's effort to have Sessions limit the scope of the special counsel's investigation to future elections interference was intended to prevent further investigative scrutiny of the President and his campaign conduct. Is that correct?
Generally.
And so, Mr. Mueller, you have seen the letter where 1,000 former Republican and Democratic federal prosecutors have read your report and said anyone but the President who committed those acts would be charged with obstruction of justice. Do you agree with those former colleagues, 1,000 prosecutors who came to that conclusion?
Those prosecutors.
What?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over here.
You're not going to let him answer that question?
You guys, your team.
Are you effing kidding me?
Report, quote, this is the top of page 2, volume 1, also on page 173, by the way.
Did the
you said
tape just
that
skip?
you'd come to the conclusion that, quote, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities, close quote.
The woman who's running
That's
against Nadler
right?
should use that.
That's accurate.
You should
And
cut a spot
I'm curious,
at that gavel.
when did you
you
personally
kidding
come
me?
to that conclusion?
I'm starting to feel, I was really focused today on reminding
can you
everybody
remind me,
that Robert Mueller
which
helped
paragraph
lie
you're
about
referring to?
Top of page 2.
WMDs
On 2.
and
Volume
trapped
1.
people, in my opinion. But now I just feel like he deserves some chicken noodle soup.
And exactly
very
which
tired.
paragraph are you looking at on 2?
Investigation did not establish.
Of course. I see it. Yes.
See it?
What was your question?
My question now is, when did you personally reach that conclusion?
Well, we were ongoing for 2 years.
Right, you were ongoing, you wrote it at some point during that 2-year period, but at some point you had to come to a conclusion that that I don't think that there's not a conspiracy going on here. There was no conspiracy between this president. I'm not talking about the rest of the president's team. I'm talking about this president and the Russians.
As you understand, developing a criminal case, you get pieces of information, witnesses, and the like, as you make your case.
Right.
And when you make a decision on a particular case depends on a number of factors.
Right, I understand.
So I cannot say specifically that we reached a decision on a particular defendant at a particular point in time.
But it was some time well before you wrote the report, fair enough? I mean, you wrote the report dealing with a whole myriad of issues. Certainly at some time prior to that report is when you reached the decision that, okay, with regard to the president himself, I don't find anything here. Fair enough?
Well, I'm not certain I do agree with that.
So you waited till the last minute when you were actually writing the report and say, oh, okay.
No, but there are various aspects of the development of
Sure, and that's my point.
there are various aspects that happen, but somewhere along the pike, you will come to a conclusion. There's no there for this defendant. Isn't that right? So apparently,
I can't speak.
You can't say when. Fair enough. So I'm asking the sworn witness. Mr. Mueller, evidence suggests that on May 10th, 2017, at approximately 7:45 a.m., 6 days before the DAG Deputy Attorney General appointed you special counsel, Mr. Rosenstein called you and mentioned the appointment of a special counsel. Not necessarily that you'd be appointed, but that you had a discussion of that. Is that true? May 10th, 2017.
I don't have any. I don't have any knowledge of that occurring.
You don't have any knowledge, or you don't recall?
I don't have any knowledge.
Evidence also suggests.
Given that what I saw you do, are you questioning that?
Well, I just find it intriguing. Let me just tell you that there's evidence that suggests that phone call took place and that's what was said. So let's move to the next question. Evidence suggests that also on May 12, 2017, 5 days before the DAG appointed you special counsel, you met with Mr. Rosenstein in person. Did you discuss the appointment of a special counsel then? Not necessarily that you, but that there would be a special counsel.
I've gone into waters that don't allow me to give you an answer to that particular question. It relates to the internal discussions he would have in terms of indicting an individual.
It has nothing to do with indictment. It has to do with special counsel and whether you discussed that with Mr. Rosenstein. Evidence also suggests that on May 13th, 4 days before you were appointed special counsel, you met with former Attorney General Sessions and Rosenstein, and you spoke about special counsel. Do you remember that?
Not offhand, no.
Okay. And on May 16th, the day before you were appointed special counsel, you met with the President and Rod Rosenstein. Do you remember having that meeting?
Yes.
And discussion of the position of FBI Director took place. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And did you discuss at any time in that meeting Mr. Comey's termination?
No.
Did you discuss at any time in that meeting the potential appointment of a special counsel? Not necessarily you, but just in general terms.
I can't get into the discussions on that.
How many times did you speak to Mr. Rosenstein before May 17th, which is the day you got appointed, regarding the appointment of special counsel? How many times prior to that did you discuss?
I can't tell you how many times.
Is that because you don't recall, or are you just?
I do not recall.
Okay, thank you. How many times did you speak with Mr. Comey about any investigations pertaining to Russia prior to May 17, 2017? Did you have any?
Not at all.
Zero?
Zero.
Okay. Now, my time has expired. So,
time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California.
Director Mueller, going back to the president's obstruction via Corey Lewandowski, it was referenced that 1,000 former prosecutors who served under Republican and Democratic administrations with 12,000 years of federal service wrote a letter regarding the president's conduct. Are you familiar with that letter?
I've read about that letter, yes.
And some of the individuals who signed that letter, the statement of former prosecutors, are people you worked with. Is that right?
Quite probably, yes.
People that you respect?
Quite probably, yes.
And in that letter, they said all of this conduct, trying to control and impede the investigation against the president by leveraging his authority over others, is similar to conduct we have seen charged against other public officials and people in powerful positions. Are they wrong?
They have a different case.
Do you want to sign that letter, Director Mueller?
They have a different case.
Director Mueller, thank you for your service, going all the way back to the 60s when you courageously served in Vietnam. Because I have a seat on the Intelligence Committee, I'll have questions later, and because of our limited time, I will ask to enter this letter into the record under unanimous consent and yield to my colleague from California, Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Director Mueller, for your long history of service to our country, including your service as a Marine, where you earned a Bronze Star with a V device. I'd like to now turn to the elements of obstruction of justice as applied to the President's attempts to curtail your investigation.
Jesus.
The first element of obstruction of
They
justice
obviously all
an
agreed to
obstructive
focus
act,
on this
correct?
exact one
I'd like to direct
point.
you to page 97 of Volume 2 of your report. And you wrote there on page 97, quote, Sessions was being instructed to tell the special counsel to end the existing investigation into the president and his campaign, unquote. That's in the report, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That would be evidence of an obstructive act because it would naturally obstruct their investigation, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's turn now to the second element of the crime of obstruction of justice, which requires a nexus to an official proceeding. Again, I'm going to direct you to page 97, the same page of volume 2, and you wrote, quote, by the time of the president's initial one-on-one meeting with Lewandowski on June 19, 2017, the existence of a grand jury investigation supervised by the special counsel was public knowledge. That's in the report, correct?
Correct.
That would constitute evidence of a nexus to an official proceeding because a grand jury investigation is an official proceeding, correct?
Well, yes.
Okay. I'd like to now turn to the final element of the crime of obstruction of justice. On that same page, page 97, do you see where there's the intent section on that page?
I do see
Part
that.
C. All right. Would you be willing to read the first sentence?
And that was starting with?
Substantial evidence.
Indicates that the president's?
Yeah, if you could read that first sentence, would you be willing to do that?
I'm happy to have you read it.
Okay, I will read it then. You wrote, quote, substantial evidence indicates that the president's effort to have Sessions limit the scope of the special counsel's investigation to future election interference was intended to prevent further investigative scrutiny of the president's and his campaign's conduct, unquote. That's in the report, correct?
That is in the report, and I rely what's in the report to indicate what's happened in the paragraphs that we've been discussing.
Thank you. So to recap what we've heard, we have heard today that the president ordered former White House counsel Don McGahn to fire you. The president ordered Don McGahn to then cover that up and create a false paper trail. And now we've heard the president ordered Corey Lewandowski to tell Jeff Sessions to limit your investigation so that you stop investigating the president. I believe a reasonable person looking at these facts could conclude that all three elements of the crime of obstruction of justice have been met. And I'd like to ask you, the reason, again, that you did not indict Donald Trump is because of OLC opinion stating that you cannot indict a sitting president, correct?
That is correct.
The fact that their orders by the president were not carried out, that is not a defense to obstruction of justice because the statute itself is quite broad. It says that as long as you endeavor or attempt to obstruct justice, that would also constitute a crime.
I'm not going to get into that at this juncture.
Okay. What? Thank you. And based on...
He already answered that with Cicilline, didn't he?
I believe a reasonable person could conclude that at least 3 crimes of obstruction of justice by the president occurred. We're going to hear about 2 additional crimes. That would be the witness tamperings of Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort.
All that, the only thing I want to add is that I'm going through the elements with you does not mean that I subscribe to what you're trying to prove through those elements.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from Arizona. I'm sorry, gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mueller, over here. Thanks for joining us today. You had 3 discussions with Rod Rosenstein about your appointment as special counsel, May 10th, May 12th, and May 13th, correct?
If you say so, I have no reason to dispute that.
Then you met with the president on the 16th with Rod Rosenstein present, and then on the 17th you were formally appointed as special counsel. Were you meeting with the president on the 16th with knowledge that you were under consideration for appointment to special counsel?
I did not believe I was under consideration for counsel. I had served 2 terms as FBI director.
So the answer is no.
And the answer is no.
Greg Jarrett describes your office as the team of partisans. And as additional information is coming to light, there's a growing concern that political bias caused important facts to be omitted from your report in order to cast the president unfairly in a negative light. For example, John Dowd, the president's lawyer, leaves a message with Michael Flynn's lawyer on November 17th of 2017, November 2017. The edited version in your report makes it appear that he was improperly asking for confidential information, and that's all we'd know from your report, except that the judge in the Flynn case ordered the entire transcript released, in which Dowd makes it crystal clear that's not what he was suggesting. So my question is, why did you edit the transcript to hide the exculpatory part of the message?
Well, I'm not certain I would agree with your characterization as that we did anything to hide
Well, you omitted it. You quoted the part where he says we need some kind of heads up just for the sake of protecting all of our interests if we can, but you omitted the portion where he says without giving up any confidential information.
Well, I'm not going to go further in terms of discussing the...
Well, let's go on. You extensively discussed Konstantin Kilimnik's activities with Paul Manafort. You describe him as, quote, a Russian-Ukrainian political consultant and longtime employee of Paul Manafort, assessed by the FBI to have ties to Russian intelligence. And again, that's all we know from your report, except we've since learned from news articles that Kilimnik was actually a U.S. State Department intelligence source, yet nowhere in your report is he so identified. Why was that fact?
I don't necessarily credit what you're saying occurred.
Were you aware that Kilimnik was
I'm not going to go into the ins and outs. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of what we had in the court. In the course of our investigation.
Did you interview Konstantin Kilimnik?
Pardon?
Did you interview Konstantin Kilimnik?
I can't go into the discussion of our investigative moves.
And yet that is the basis of your
There's
report.
so much that we apparently are not allowed to know about
We have to rely on your report for an accurate
incredibly
reflection of the evidence, and we're starting to find out that's not true. For example,
and then what it does is it opens it up to this type of
with the Russian government.
Of a conspiracy theory
In
mongering.
the Concord Management IRA prosecution that you initiated, the judge excoriated both you and Mr. Barr for producing no evidence to support this claim. Why did you suggest Russia was responsible for the troll farms when in court you've been unable to produce any evidence to support it?
Well, I'm not going to get into that any further than I already have.
But you have left the clear impression throughout the country through your report that it was the Russian government behind the troll farms, and yet when you're called upon to provide actual evidence in court, you fail to do so.
Well, I would again dispute your characterization of what occurred in that proceeding.
In fact, the judge, considered holding prosecutors in criminal contempt. She backed off only after your hastily called press conference the next day in which you retroactively made the distinction between the Russian government and the Russia troll farms. Did your press conference of May 29th have anything to do with the threat to hold your prosecutors in contempt the previous day for publicly misrepresenting the evidence?
What was the question?
The question is, did your May 29th press conference have anything to do with the fact that the previous day the judge threatened to hold your prosecutors in contempt for misrepresenting evidence?
No.
Now, the fundamental problem is, as I said, we've got to take your word. Your team faithfully, accurately, impartially, and completely described all of the underlying evidence in the Mueller report, and we're finding more and more instances where this just isn't the case. And it's starting to look like, having desperately tried and failed to make a legal case against the president, you made a political case instead. You put it in a paper sack, lit it on fire, dropped it on our porch, rang the doorbell, and ran.
I don't think you will
Adam Sandler
reviewed a report that is
Have
as
you ever
thorough,
watched
as
Happy
fair,
Gilmore?
as consistent as the report that we have in
It's a
front of us.
really funny bit.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Director Mueller, let's go to a fourth episode of obstruction of justice in the form of witness tampering, which is urging witnesses not to cooperate with law enforcement, either by persuading them or intimidating them. Witness tampering is a felony punishable by 20 years in prison. You found evidence that the president engaged in efforts, and I quote, to encourage witnesses not to cooperate with the investigation. Is that right?
That's correct. Do you have a citation?
I'm page 7 on volume 2.
Thank you.
Now, one of these witnesses was Michael Cohen, the president's personal lawyer, who ultimately pled guilty to campaign violations based on secret hush money payments to two women the president knew, and also to lying to Congress about the hoped-for $1 billion Trump Tower deal. After the FBI searched Cohen's home, the president called him up personally, he said, to check in and told him to, quote, hang in there and stay strong. Is that right? Do you remember finding that?
If it's in the report as stated, yes, it is right.
Yes, also in the report actually are a series of calls made by other friends of the president. One reached out to say he was with the boss in Mar-a-Lago, and the president said, he loves you. His name is redacted. Another redacted friend called to say, the boss loves you, and a third redacted friend called to say, everyone knows the boss has your back. Do you remember finding that sequence of calls?
Generally, yes.
When the news, and in fact, Cohen said that following the receipt of these messages, I'm quoting here, page 147 of volume 2, he believed he had the support of the White House if he continued to toe the party line, and he determined to stay on message and be part of the team. That's at page 147. Do you remember generally finding that?
Generally, yes.
Well,
Only generally.
and Robert Costello, a lawyer close to the president's legal team, emailed Cohen to say, quote, "You are loved, they are in our corner, sleep well tonight, and you have friends in high places." And that's up on the screen, page 147. You remember reporting that. Okay. Now, when the news first broke that Cohen had arranged payoffs to Stormy Daniels, Cohen faithfully stuck to this party line. He said that publicly that neither the Trump organization nor the Trump campaign was a party to the transaction, and neither reimbursed him. Trump's personal attorney at that point quickly texted Cohen to say, quote, "Client says thank you for what you do." Mr. Mueller, who is the capital C client thanking Cohen for what he does?
I can't speak to that.
Okay, the assumption in the context suggests very strongly it's President Trump.
I can't speak to that.
Okay. Cohen later broke and pled guilty to campaign finance offenses and admitted fully they were made, quote, "at the direction of candidate Trump." Do you remember that?
Yes.
After Cohen's guilty plea, the president suddenly changed his tune towards Mr. Cohen, didn't he?
I would say I rely on what's in the report.
Well, he made the suggestion that Cohen family members had committed crimes. He targeted, for example, Cohen's father-in-law and repeatedly suggested that he was guilty of committing crimes, right?
Generally accurate.
Okay. On page 154, you give a powerful summary of these changing dynamics. And you said, I'm happy to have you read it, but I'm happy to do it if not.
I have it in front of me. Thank you.
Would you like to read it?
I would.
Can you read it out loud to everybody?
I would be happy to have you read it out.
Okay, very. We'll read it at the same time. The evidence
that's some
concerning this
ginger ale.
sequence of events could support an inference that the president used
It's
inducements in
unbelievable
the form
that
of
they will
positive
not force
messages
him to read
in an
this
effort to
shit.
get Cohen not to cooperate, and then turn
Like, their
to
posture
attacks
towards
and
Mueller has
intimidation
been
to
far
deter the provision of
too
information
deferential.
or to undermine Cohen's credibility once Cohen
You're
began
a
cooperating.
witness
I believe that's
before
accurate.
Okay.
the hearing.
And in my
You
view,
want to
anyone else
argue
in
that your
America
report
engaged in these
speaks for
actions,
itself.
they would have been
Reports
charged with
don't
witness
speak.
tampering. We must enforce
Read
the
it.
principle in Congress that you emphasize so well in the very last sentence of your report, which is
Can
that in
you
America,
repeat that,
no
Sam?
person is so high as to be above the law. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Then if he wants to, he can read it.
Thank
like,
you, Mr. Chairman. Just recently, Mr.
uh,
Mueller, you said Mr.
Okay, I'll read it,
Liu
and
was
also thanks for
asking you
Vietnam.
questions. And Mr. Liu's
Right,
question,
exactly.
I quote, "The reason you didn't indict the president is because of the OLC opinion." And you answered, "That is correct." But that is not what you said in the report,
My
and
name's
it's not
Debbie
what you told
Lesko.
Attorney General Barr.
I'm built
in
for
fact,
poor-
in a
for
joint
Polish jokes.
statement that you released with DOJ on May 29th, after your press conference, your office issued a joint statement with the Department of Justice that said, "The Attorney General has previously stated that the special counsel repeatedly affirmed that he was not saying that but for the OLC opinion, he would have found the president obstructed justice. The special counsel's report and his statement today made clear that the office concluded it would not reach a determination one way or the other
Didn't even
whether
look
the
at it.
president committed a crime. There is no conflict between these statements." So, Mr. Miller, do you stand by your joint statement with DOJ that you issued on May 29th as you sit here today?
I would have to look at it more closely before I said I agree with it.
Well, so
I didn't
my
anticipate you that.
conclusion is that what you told Mr. Liu really contradicts what you said in the report, and specifically what you said apparently repeatedly to Attorney General Barr, and then you issued a joint statement on May 29th saying that the Attorney General has previously stated that the special counsel repeatedly affirmed that he was not saying, but for the OLC report, that we would have found the president obstructed justice. So I just say there's a conflict. I do have some more questions. Mr. Mueller, There's been a lot of talk today about firing the special counsel and curtailing the investigation. Were you ever fired, Mr. Mueller, from
Was I
special?
what?
Were you ever fired as special counsel, Mr. Mueller?
No.
No.
Not
Were
that I
you
know of. I
allowed
might have
to
been.
complete your investigation
I have some
unencumbered?
soup.
Yes.
And in fact, you resigned as special counsel when you closed up the office in late May 2019. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller,
Are you queuing
on
on?
April 18th, the Attorney General held a press conference in
Mr.
conjunction
Mueller,
with the
are
public
you
release of
and
your
President
report.
Trump ready to
Did
reveal
Attorney
phase
General
2?
Barr say anything inaccurate
John
either in
Podesta's
his press
child rape
conference
tape?
or his
I think
March
that's what many
24th
of us
letter
on the
to
committee would
Congress
like to know.
summarizing the principal conclusions of your report?
When can we finally bring JFK
what
Jr.
you're not
back?
mentioning is a letter we sent on March
Don't
27th.
want him in hiding anymore.
To Mr. Barr that raised some issues. And that letter speaks for itself.
But then I don't see how you that could be, since AG Barr's letter detailed the principal conclusions of your report, and you have said before that there wasn't anything inaccurate. In fact, you had this joint statement. But let me go on to another question. Mr. Mueller, rather than purely relying on the evidence provided by witnesses and documents, I think you relied a lot on media. I'd like to know how many times you cited the Washington Post in your report.
How many times I what?
Cited the Washington Post in your report.
I do not have
More than a
knowledge
bread
of
box?
that figure, but that's it. I don't have knowledge of that figure.
I counted about 60 times. How many times did you cite the New York Times? I counted.
Again, I have
Oh, here we go.
No
How many times did you
I counted about 75
cite
times.
the Free
How many
Beacon?
times did you cite Fox News?
Failing New York Times.
as with the other two, I have.
Any
no
times you'll reference
About 25
Breitbart.
times. I've got to
You old
say, it
communist.
looks like volume
How many
2
times
is
did you
mostly
reference Quillette?
regurgitated press stories. Honestly, there's almost nothing in volume 2 that I couldn't already hear or know simply by having a $50 cable news subscription. However, your investigation cost the American taxpayers $25 million. Mr.
Paid
Mueller,
for
you
it with
cited media
Manafort's
reports
money.
nearly 200 times in your report. Then in a footnote, a small footnote, number 7, page 15 of volume 2 of your report, you wrote, I quote, "This section summarizes and cites various news stories, not
was
for the
Rachel
truth
Maddow
of the
that spun
information
this here.
contained in the stories, but rather to place candidate Trump's response to those stories in context. Since nobody but lawyers reads footnotes, are you concerned that the American public took the embedded news stories at
Time of the
face value?"
gentlelady has expired. The gentlelady from Washington.
Can Mr. Mueller
No.
answer the question?
No, we're running short.
No. No. I'm getting very agitated. and I want to
I
connect
said the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you. Director Mueller, let's turn to the 5th of the obstruction episodes in your
Oh,
report.
sweet
And that is
Lord.
the evidence
This is
of
what
whether
they've all-
President Trump engaged in witness tampering
guys are
with Trump
really
campaign
doing
chairman
something.
Paul Manafort, whose foreign ties were critical
I've got
to
a
your
great idea.
investigation
Let's
into
take
Russia's
the
interference
least sexy,
in our
the most
elections.
dry
And this
parts
starts
of
at
this
volume
report,
2,
and then
page
hammer the hell
123.
out of it.
Your office got indictments against Manafort and Trump deputy campaign manager Rick Gates in 2 different jurisdictions, correct?
Correct.
And your office found that after a grand jury
Oh my
indicted
God,
them,
Hail Mary,
Manafort
ask
told
about the
Gates
fucking
not to
T-tape.
plead guilty
Well,
to any
here's the
charges
point, is
because,
that,
quote,
like,
he had
yes,
talked to the
these are
president's personal
there are-
counsel, and they
they're
were
going through
to
all the
take care
different
of us. Is that correct?
examples in which the
according to your
president
report, one
could
day
be
after
indicted
Manafort's
and might be
conviction on
indicted
8
when he
felony
leaves office
charges,
on
quote,
obstruction of
the
justice.
president said that flipping
But-
was
Should be
not
totally
fair
unfair.
and almost
But-
ought to be outlawed.
Impeachment
I'm aware of that.
In
is
this
a
context, Director Mueller, what
political
does it mean to
process. This
flip?
is all about
Have somebody
politics at this
cooperate
point.
in a criminal investigation.
And
And how essential
they're
is that
failing at the
cooperation
politics.
to
They're just
any
not.
efforts to combat crime?
I'm not going to go beyond that, characterizing.
Of course they're
that
failing.
Thank you.
effort.
In your report, you concluded that President Trump and his personal counsel, Rudy Giuliani, quote, made repeated statements suggesting that a pardon was a possibility for Manafort, while also making it clear that the president did not want Manafort to flip and cooperate with the government, end quote. Is that correct?
Correct.
And as you
wonder if
stated
Mueller
earlier,
is
witness
ill.
tampering can be shown where someone with an improper motive encourages another person not to cooperate with law enforcement. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, on page 123 of Volume 2, you also discuss the president's motive, and you say that as court proceedings move forward against Manafort, President Trump, quote, discussed with aides whether and in what way Manafort might be cooperating and whether Manafort knew any information that would be harmful to the president, end quote. Is that correct?
And that was a quote from?
From page 123, Volume 2.
I have it. Thank you. Yes.
And when someone tries to stop another person from working with law enforcement and they do it because they're worried about what that person will say, it seems clear from what you wrote that this is a classic definition of witness tampering. Now, Mr. Manafort did eventually decide to cooperate with your office, and he entered into a plea agreement, but then he broke that agreement. Can you describe what he did that caused you to tell the court that the agreement was off?
I'd refer you to the court proceedings on that issue.
So on page 127 of Volume 2, you told the court that Mr. Manafort lied about a number of matters that were material to the investigation, and you said that the Manafort's lawyers also, quote, regularly briefed the president's lawyers on topics discussed and the information that Manafort had provided in interviews with the special counsel's office. Does that sound right?
And the source of that is?
That's page 127, Volume 2. That's a direct quote.
If it's from the report, yes, I'd support it.
And 2 days after you told the court that Manafort broke his plea agreement by lying repeatedly, did President Trump tell the press that Mr. Manafort was, quote, very brave because he did not flip? This is page 128 of Volume 2.
If it's in the report, I support it as it is set forth.
Thank you. Director Mueller, in your report, you
Very
make a
brave.
very
He wasn't a
serious
rat.
conclusion about the evidence regarding the president's involvement with the Manafort criminal proceedings. Let me read to you from your report. Evidence concerning the president's conduct toward Manafort indicates that the president intended to encourage Manafort to not cooperate with the government. It is clear that the president both publicly and privately discouraged Mr. Manafort's cooperation or flipping while also dangling the promise of a pardon if he stayed loyal and did not share what he knew about the president. Anyone else who did these things would be prosecuted for them. We must ensure that no one is above the law. And I thank you for being here, Director Mueller. Yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mueller, I'm over here, I'm sorry. Mr. Mueller, are you familiar with the now expired independent counsel statute? It's the statute under which Ken Starr was appointed.
That Ken Starr did what? I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with the independent counsel statute?
Are you talking about the one we operating under now or a previous?
No, under which Ken Starr was appointed?
I am not that familiar with that, but I'd be happy to take your question.
Well, the Clinton administration allowed the independent counsel statute to expire after Ken Starr's investigation. The final report requirement was a major reason why the statute was allowed to expire. Even President Clinton's AG, Janet Reno, expressed concerns about the final report requirement. And I'll quote AG Reno. She said, on one hand, the American people have an interest in knowing the outcome of an investigation of their highest officials. On the other hand, the report requirement cuts against many of the most basic traditions and practices of American law enforcement. Under our system, we presume innocence and we value privacy. We believe that information obtained during a criminal investigation should, in most cases, be made public only if there is an indictment and prosecution, not in a lengthy and detailed report filed after a decision has been made not to prosecute. The final report provides a forum for unfairly airing a target's dirty laundry, and it also creates yet another incentive for an independent counsel to over-investigate in order to justify his or her tenure and to avoid criticism that the independent counsel may have
as such, this...
Again, Mr. Mueller, those are AG Reno's words. Didn't you do exactly what AG Reno feared? Didn't you publish a lengthy report unfairly airing
I'm not an independent counsel.
Without recommending charges?
I'm not Attorney General.
I disagree with that.
Okay. Did any of your witnesses have the chance to be cross-examined?
Can I just finish my answer on that?
Quickly.
I operate under the current statute, not the
Right.
original statute. So I am most familiar with the current statute, not the older statute.
Did any of the witnesses have a chance to be cross-examined?
Did any of the witnesses in our investigation?
Yes.
I'm not going to answer that.
Okay. Did you allow the people mentioned in your report to challenge how they were characterized?
I'm not going to get into
Okay.
into that.
Given that AG Barr stated multiple times during his confirmation hearing that he would make as much of your report public as possible, did you write your report knowing that it would likely be shared with the public?
No.
Did knowing that the report could and likely would be made public, did that alter the contents which you included?
I can't speak to that.
Despite the expectations that your report would be released to the public, you left out significant exculpatory evidence. In other words, evidence favorable to the president, correct?
Well, pause it. Oh,
Well, I actually would disagree with you. I think we put into
he
the
said
report
that he didn't know it was going to be released to the
I got into
public.
that with you, where you said there was evidence you left out.
Well, you make a choice as to what goes into
Isn't it
an
true,
indictment.
Mr. Mueller, isn't it true that on page 1 of volume 2, you state, when you're quoting the statute, that you had an obligation to either prosecute or not prosecute?
Well, generally that is the case.
Right.
Although most cases are not done in the context of the president.
And in this case, you made a decision not to prosecute, correct?
No, we made a decision not to decide whether to prosecute or not.
So essentially what your report did was everything that AG Reno warned against.
I can't agree with that characterization.
Well, what you did is you compiled a nearly 450.
She might have been a lesbian that looked like Will
pages
Ferrell, but
of the
she
very
warned
worst
against
information
this
you gathered
kid.
against the target of your investigation, who happens to be the president of the United States.
This guy should break
You
a,
did
like,
this knowing that you were
Budweiser
not
on
going
his
to
head.
recommend
He's like,
charges,
"That was
and that the
E.G.
report
Reno,
would be made public.
Not true.
Mr. Mueller, as a former officer in the United States JAG Corps, I prosecuted nearly 100 terrorists in a Baghdad courtroom. I cross-examined the butcher of Fallujah in defense of our Navy SEALs. As a civilian, I was elected a magisterial district judge in Pennsylvania. So I'm very well versed in the American legal
That's
system.
what A.G. Reno said.
The drafting and the publication of some of the information in this report without an indictment,
Not funny anymore.
without prosecution, frankly flies in the face of American justice. And I find those facts, this entire process, un-American. I yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Mr. Jordan.
Cool, man.
Director Mueller, the third FISA renewal happens a month after you're named special counsel.
That
What role
kind of
did your
shit
office
doesn't
play
come
in the
off well
third
to
FISA
normal
renewal
people.
of Carter Page?
Great if he was just like, well, it's too bad, young man. You
Time
go
of the
fuck
gentleman
yourself.
has expired. The gentlelady from
I'm
Florida.
going to go drink some Metamucil.
Director Mueller, a couple of my colleagues right here wanted to talk to you or ask you about lies. So let's talk about lies. According to your report, page 9, volume 1, witnesses lied to your office and to Congress. Those lies materially impaired the investigation of Russia interference, according to your report. Other than the individuals who pled guilty to crimes based on their lying to you and your team, did other witnesses lie to you?
I think there are probably a spectrum of witnesses in terms of those who are not telling the full truth and those who are outright liars.
Thank you very much. Outright liars. It is fair to say then that there were limits on what evidence was available to your investigation of both Russia election interference and obstruction of justice.
That's true, and it's usually the case.
And that lies by Trump campaign officials and administration officials impeded your investigation.
I would generally agree with that.
Thank you so much, Director Mueller. You will be hearing more from me in the next hearing, so I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Correa. Thank you.
Mr. Mueller,
First of all, let me welcome you. Thank you for your service to our country. You're a hero, Vietnam War vet, wounded war vet. We won't forget your service to our country.
Thank you, sir.
I may begin. Because of time limits, we have gone in depth on only 5 possible episodes of obstruction. There's so much more. And I want to focus on another section of obstruction, which is the president's conduct concerning Michael Flynn, the president's national security advisor.
More obstruction.
In early 27, the White House counsel and the president were informed that Mr. Flynn had lied to government authorities about his communications with the Russian ambassador during the Trump campaign and transition. Is this correct?
Correct.
If a hostile nation knows that a U.S. official has lied publicly, that can be used to blackmail that government official, correct?
I'm not going to speak to that. I don't disagree with it necessarily, but I'm not going to speak to any more to that issue.
Thank you very much, sir. Flynn resigned on February 13, 2016. And the very next day, when the president was having lunch with New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, did the president say, open quotes, "Now that we fired Flynn, the Russia thing is over," close quote. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is it true that Christie responded by saying, open quotes, "No way, and this Russia thing is far from over," close quote?
That's the way we have it in the report.
Thank you. And after the president met with Christie, later that same day, the president arranged to meet with then FBI Director James Comey, alone in the Oval Office, correct?
Correct, particularly if you have the citation to the report.
Page 3940, Volume 2.
Thank you very much.
And according to Comey, the president told him, "I hope," open quote, "I hope you can see your way to letting this thing go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy, and I hope you can let it go," close quote. Page 40, Volume 2.
Accurate.
What did Comey understand the president to be asking?
I'm not going to get into what was in Mr. Comey's mind.
Comey understood this to be a direction because of the president's position and the circumstances of the one-to-one meeting. Page 40, Volume 2.
Well, I understand it's in the report, and I support it as being in the report.
Thank you, sir. Even though the president publicly denied telling Comey to drop the investigation, you found, open quote, substantial evidence corroborating Comey's account over the president's. Is this correct?
That's correct.
The president fired Comey on May 9th. Is that correct, sir?
I believe that's the accurate date.
That's page 77, Volume 2. You found substantial evidence that the catalyst for the president's firing of Comey was Comey's, open quote, unwillingness to publicly state that the president was not personally under investigation.
I'm not going to delve more into the details of what happened. If it's in the report, then I'm supportive because it's already been reviewed and appropriately appears in the report.
And that's page 75, Volume 2.
Thank you.
Thank you. And in fact, the very next day, the president told the Russian foreign minister, open quote, "I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I face great pressure because of Russia." That's taken
Real nut
off.
job, that guy.
I'm not under
Head of our
investigation,
FBI,
close quote.
nut
Is that
job.
correct?
That's what was written in the report, yes.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mueller, we've heard a lot about what you're not going to talk about today, so let's talk about something that you should be able to talk about, the law itself, the underlying obstruction statute, and your creative legal analysis of the statutes in Volume 2, particularly your interpretation of 18 U.S.C. 1512C. Section 1512C is an obstruction of justice statute created as part of auditing and financial regulations for public companies, and as you write on page 164 of Volume 2, this provision was added as a floor amendment in the Senate and explained as closing a certain loophole with respect to document shredding. And to read the statute, whoever corruptly alters, destroys, mutilates, or conceals a record, document, or other object, or attempts to do so with the intent to impair the object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding, or otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so, shall be fined under the statute or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. Your analysis and application of the statute proposes to give Clause C2 a much broader interpretation than commonly used. First, your analysis proposes to read Clause C2 in isolation, reading it as a freestanding, all-encompassing provision prohibiting any act influencing a proceeding if done with an improper motive. And second, your analysis of the statute to apply the proposes to apply the sweeping prohibition to lawful acts taken by public officials exercising their discretionary powers if those acts influence a proceeding. So, Mr. Mueller, I'd ask you, in analyzing the obstruction, you state that you recognize that the Department of Justice and the courts have not definitively resolved these issues, correct?
Correct.
You'd agree that not everyone in the Justice Department agreed with your legal theory of the obstruction of justice statutes, correct?
I'm not going to be involved in the discussion on that at this juncture.
In fact, the Attorney General himself disagrees with your interpretation of the law, correct?
I leave that to the Attorney General to identify.
And you would agree that prosecutors sometimes incorrectly apply the law, correct?
I would have to agree with that one.
And members of your legal team, in fact, have had convictions overturned because they were based on an incorrect legal theory, correct?
I don't know to what you advert. We've all spent time
fact,
in the trenches trying cases, have not won every one of those cases.
Well, let me ask you about one in particular. One of your top prosecutors, Andrew Weissman, obtained a conviction against auditing firm Arthur Anderson, lower court, which was subsequently overturned in a unanimous Supreme Court decision that rejected the legal theory advanced by Weissman, correct?
Well, I'm not going to delve into
Let me read from that. Maybe it'll
May I just finish
Yes.
my answer to say that I'm not going to get involved in a discussion on that. I will refer you to that citation that you gave me at the outset for the lengthy discussion on just what you're talking about, and to the extent that I have anything to say about it, it is what we've already put into the report on that
issue. I am reading from your report when discussing this section, and I'll read from the decision of the Supreme Court unanimously reversing Mr. Weissman when he said, indeed, it's striking how little culpability the instructions required. For example, the jury was told that even if petitioner honestly and sincerely believed his conduct was lawful, the jury could convict. The instructions also diluted the meaning of corruptly such that it covered innocent conduct.
Let me just say, put a word for...
Let me move on. I've limited time. Your report takes the broadest possible reading of this provision and applying it to the president's official acts, and I'm concerned about the implications of your theory for over-criminalizing conduct by public officials and private citizens alike. So to emphasize how broad your theory of liability is, I want to ask you about a few examples. On October 11th, 2015, during the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server, President Obama said, "I don't think it posed a national security problem." And he later said, "I can tell you that this is not a situation in which America's national security was endangered." Assuming for a moment that his comments did influence the investigation, couldn't President Obama be charged under your interpretation with obstruction of justice?
Well, again, I refer you to the report, but let me say with Andrew Weissman, who is one of the more talented attorneys that we have and have on board.
Okay, well, I'll take that
over a period of time. He has run a number of units.
I have very limited time.
What just happened? Here we go. Back on this. Sorry about this, folks. Give us 1 second.
Seems to be a clear example of somebody within the executive branch attempting to influence an FBI investigation. So under your theory, couldn't that person be charged with obstruction as long as a prosecutor could come up with a potentially corrupt motive?
I refer you to our lengthy dissertation on exactly those issues that appears in at the end of the report.
Mr. Mueller, I'd argue that it says above the Supreme Court, equal justice under law.
Time of the gentleman has expired.
Not stretched.
Our intent was to conclude this hearing in 3 hours. Given the break, that would bring us to approximately 11:40. With Director Mueller's indulgence, we will be asking our remaining Democratic members to voluntarily limit their time below the 5 minutes so that we can complete our work as close to that time frame as possible. And I recognize
Good job,
the
guys.
gentlelady from
Time is
Pennsylvania.
running short.
Thank you.
I
Director
want
Mueller.
Zabon.
I want to ask you some questions about the president's statements regarding advanced knowledge of the WikiLeaks dumps. So the president refused to sit down with your investigators for an in-person interview, correct?
Correct.
So the only answers we have to questions from the president are contained in Appendix C to your report.
That's correct.
Okay, so looking at Appendix C on page 5, you asked the president over a dozen questions about whether he had knowledge that WikiLeaks possessed or might possess the emails that were stolen by the Russians.
I apologize.
Sure.
Can you start it again?
Okay, sure. So we're looking at Appendix C.
Right.
And at Appendix C, page 5, you asked the president about a dozen questions about whether he had knowledge that WikiLeaks possessed the stolen emails that might be released in a way helpful to his campaign or harmful to the Clinton campaign. Is that correct? You asked those questions? Okay. In February of this year, Mr. Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, testified to Congress under oath that, quote, Mr. Trump knew from Roger Stone in advance about the WikiLeaks drop of emails, end quote. That's a matter of public record, isn't it?
Well, are you referring to the report or some other public record?
This was testimony before Congress by Mr. Cohen. Do you know if he told you?
I'm not familiar with it, explicitly familiar with what he testified to before Congress.
Okay. Let's look at an event described on page 18 of volume 2 of your report. Now, and we're going to put it up in a slide, I think. According to Deputy Campaign Manager Rick Gates, in the summer of 2016, he and candidate Trump were on the way to an airport shortly after WikiLeaks released its first set of stolen emails. And Gates told your investigators that candidate Trump was on a phone call, and when the call ended, Trump told Gates that more releases of damaging information would be coming, end quote. Do you recall that from the report?
If it's in the report, I support it.
Okay, and that's on page 18 of volume 2. Now, on page 77 of volume 2, your report also stated, quote, in addition, some witnesses said that Trump privately sought information about future WikiLeaks releases, end quote. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, in Appendix C, where the president did answer some written questions, he said, quote, I do not recall discussing WikiLeaks with him, nor do I recall being aware of Mr. Stone having discussed WikiLeaks with individuals associated with my campaign, end quote. Is that correct?
If it's from the report, it is correct.
Okay. So is it fair to say the president denied ever discussing WikiLeaks with Mr. Stone and denied being aware that anyone associated with his campaign discussed WikiLeaks with Stone?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one?
Is it fair then that the president denied knowledge of himself or anyone else discussing WikiLeaks dumps with Mr. Stone?
Yes.
Okay. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mueller, over here.
Mr. Mueller,
Mr. Mueller,
thank you
did
for
you indeed
killing
interview for the
Vietnamese
FBI
people,
director
but no
job
thank
one
you
day
for this,
before you were
sir.
appointed as special counsel?
My understanding, I was not applying for the job. I was asked to give my input on what it would take to do the job, which triggered the interview you're talking about.
So you don't recall on May 16th, 2017, that you interviewed with the president regarding the FBI director job?
I interviewed with the president, and
Regarding
it
the
was about,
FBI director
it
job?
was about the job and not about me applying for the job.
So your statement here today is that you didn't interview to apply for the FBI director job?
That's correct.
So did you tell the vice president that the FBI director position would be the one job that you would come back for?
Don't recall that one.
You don't recall that?
No.
Okay. Given your 22 months of investigation, tens of millions of dollars spent, and millions of documents reviewed, did you obtain any evidence at all that any American voter changed their vote as a result of Russians' election interference?
I'm not going to speak to that.
You can't speak to that? After 22 months of investigation, there's not any evidence in that document before us that any voter changed their vote because of their interference, and I'm asking you based on all of the documents that you reviewed.
That was outside our purview.
Russian meddling was outside your purview?
But the impact of that meddling was undertaken by other agencies.
Okay, you stated in your opening statement that you would not get into the details of the Steele dossier. However, multiple times in volume 2 on page 23, 27, and 28, you mentioned the unverified allegations. How long did it take you to reach the conclusion that it was unverified?
I'm not going to speak to that.
It's actually in your report multiple times that it's unverified, and you're telling me that you're not willing to tell us how you came to the conclusion that it was unverified.
True.
When did you become aware that the unverified Steele dossier was included in the FISA application to spy on Carter Page?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I'm not answering,
When did you
I'm not
become
hearing.
aware that the unverified Steele dossier was included in the FISA application to spy on Carter Page?
I'm not going to speak to that.
Your team interviewed Christopher Steele, is that correct?
Not going to get into that.
You can't,
As I said
you can't tell this committee as to whether or not you interviewed Christopher Steele in a 22-month investigation with 18 lawyers.
As I said at the outset, that is one of the investigations that is being handled by others in the Department of Justice.
Yeah, but you're here testifying about this investigation today. And I am asking you directly, did any members of your team or did you interview Christopher Steele in the course of your investigation?
And I am not going to answer that question, sir.
You had 2 years to investigate. Not once did you consider it worthy to investigate how an unverified document that was paid for by a political opponent was used to obtain a warrant to spy on the opposition political campaign. Did you do any investigation in that whatsoever?
I do not accept your characterization of what occurred.
What would be your
I'm not going to
characterization?
speak any more to it.
So you can't speak any more to it, but you're not going to agree with my characterization.
Correct.
Is that correct?
I'm like,
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, chicken
the FISA
soup now,
application
please.
makes reference to source one, who was Christopher Steele, the author of the Steele dossier. The FISA application says nothing sources one's reason for conducting the research into candidate one's ties to Russia, based on sources one previous reporting history with FBI, whereby source one provided reliable
There's an
information to
interesting
the FBI.
dynamic here where it's almost like you're more sympathetic with Mueller when you hear the Republicans talk because they're basically trying to get on Fox.
I'm not going to answer that.
For
So
being
you're
a
not
jerk.
going to respond to any of the questions regarding Christopher Steele or your interviews with them?
Well, as I said at the outset this morning, that was one of the investigations that I could not speak to.
Well, I don't understand how if you interviewed an individual on the purview of this investigation that you're testifying to us today, that you've closed that investigation, how that's not within your purview to tell us about that investigation and who you interviewed.
I have nothing to add.
Okay, well, I can guarantee you that the American people want to know. And I'm very hopeful and glad that AG Barr is looking into this and the Inspector General is looking into this because you're unwilling to answer the questions of the American people as it relates to the very basis of this investigation into the president and the very basis of this individual who you did interview. You're just refusing to answer those questions.
Yeah, how about this? Blow me.
Can't the president fire the FBI
Snap
director
time
at
soon.
any time without reason under Article 1 of the Constitution?
Yes.
Article 2?
Yes.
That's correct. Can't he also fire you as special counsel at any time without any reason?
I believe that to be the case.
Under Article 2?
Well, I would, hold on just a second. You said without any reason. I know that special counsel can be fired, but I'm not certain it extends to for whatever reason is given.
Well, and you've testified that you weren't fired. You were able to complete your investigation in full. Is that correct?
I'm not going to add to what I've stated before.
My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Fuck, man.
He looks so dissatisfied.
Well, that's
Texas.
make sure you look dissatisfied.
Thank you,
when
Mr.
you're
Chairman.
done. I
and
will.
Thank you, Mr. Mueller, for being with us not close to the afternoon now. Director Mueller, now I would like to
This is
ask you
going to
about
be
the
good.
President's answers relating to Roger Stone. Roger Stone was indicted for multiple federal crimes, and the indictment alleges that Mr. Stone discussed future WikiLeaks email releases with the Trump campaign. Understanding there's a gag order on the Stone case, I will keep my questions restricted to publicly available information. Mr. Stone's indictment...
Let me just say at the outset, I don't mean to disrupt you, but I'm not, I would like some demarcation of that which is applicable to this, but also in such a way that it does not hinder the other prosecution that is taking place in D.C.
I understand that. I'm only going to be talking about the questions that you asked in writing to the president.
Thank you, ma'am.
That relate to Mr. Stone. Mr. Stone's indictment states, among other things, the following, quote, Stone was contacted by senior Trump officials to inquire about future releases of Organization One being WikiLeaks. The indictment continues, quote, Stone thereafter told the Trump campaign about potential future releases of damaging material by WikiLeaks. So in short, the indictment alleges that Stone was asked by the Trump campaign to get information about more WikiLeaks releases, and that Stone, in fact, did tell the Trump campaign about potential future releases, correct?
Yes, ma'am, but I see you're quoting from the indictment, and even though the indictment is a public document, I feel uncomfortable discussing anything having to do with the Stone prosecution.
Right, the indictment is of record, and we pulled it off of the, I'm reading straight from it. Well, turning back to the President's answers to your questions then on this very subject, the President denied ever discussing future WikiLeaks releases with Stone and denied knowing whether anyone else on his campaign had those discussions with Stone. If you had learned that other witnesses, putting aside the President, if other witnesses had lied to you investigators in response to Pacific's questions, whether in writing or in an interview, could they be charged with false statement crimes?
Well, I'm not going to speculate. I think you're asking for me to speculate, given a set of circumstances.
Well, let's put it more specific. What if I had made a false statement to an investigator on your team? Could I go to jail for up to 5 years?
Yes.
Yes.
Although it's Congress, so.
Well, that's the point, though, isn't it? That no one is above the law.
That's true.
Not you, not the Congress, and certainly not the president. And I think it's just troubling to have to hear some of these things. And that's why the American people deserve to learn the full facts of the misconduct described in your report, for which any other person would have been charged with crimes. So thank you for being here. And again, the point has been underscored many times, but I'll repeat it. No one is above the law. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
The time, the
That was
gentleman,
really powerful.
gentleman
Not
from
my
North
America.
Dakota is recognized.
Mr. Mueller, how many people did you fire? How many people on your staff did you fire during the course of the
Frankly,
investigation?
because we all know we have
many
a double
people
tier
did you fire?
justice system.
I'm not
Smelling
going
salts don't work.
to discuss that.
You fired, according to the Inspector General's report, attorney number 2 was let go, and we know Peter Strzok was let go, correct?
Yes, and there may have been other persons on other issues that have been either transferred or fired.
Peter Strzok testified before this committee on July 12, 2018, that he was fired because you were concerned about preserving the appearance of independence. Do you agree with this testimony?
Say that again, if you could.
That he said he was fired at least partially because you were worried about concerned about preserving the appearance of independence with the special counsel's investigation. Do you agree with that statement?
The statement was by whom?
Peter Strzok at this hearing.
And I am not familiar with that.
Did you fire him because you were worried about the appearance of independence of the investigation?
No, he was transferred as a result of instances involving texts.
Do you agree that your office did not only have an obligation to operate with independence, but to operate with the appearance of independence as well?
Absolutely, we strove to do that over the 2 years.
Andrew Weissman.
Part of that was making certain that.
Andrew Weissman's one of your top attorneys?
Yes.
Did Weissman have a role in selecting other members of your team?
He had some role, but not a major role.
Andrew Weissman attended Hillary Clinton's election night party. Did you know that before or after he came onto the team?
Don't know when I found that out.
Okay. On January 30th, 2017, Weissman wrote an email to Deputy Attorney General Yates stating, "I am so proud and in awe," regarding her disobeying a direct order from the president. Did Weissman disclose that email to you before he joined the team?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about that.
Is that not a conflict of interest?
I'm not going to talk about that.
Are you aware that Ms. Jeannie Rhee represented Hillary Clinton in litigation regarding personal emails originating from Clinton's time as Secretary of State?
Yes.
Did you know that before she came on the team?
No.
Aaron Zelbley, the guy sitting next to you, represented Justin Cooper, a Clinton aide who destroyed one of Clinton's mobile devices. And you must be aware by now that 6 of your lawyers donated $12,000 directly to Hillary Clinton. I'm not even talking about the $49,000 they donated to other Democrats, just the donations to the opponent who was the target of your investigation.
Can I speak for a second to the hiring practices?
Sure.
We strove to hire those individuals that could do the job.
Sure, yeah.
I've been in this business for almost 25 years. And in those 25 years, I have not had occasion once to ask somebody about their political affiliation. It is not done. What I care about is the capability of the individual to do the job and do the job quickly and seriously and with integrity.
But that's what I'm saying, Mr. Mueller. This isn't just about you being able to vouch for your team. This is about knowing that the day you accepted this role, you had to be aware no matter what this report concluded, half of the country was going to be skeptical of your team's findings. And that's why we have recusal laws that define bias and perceive bias for this very reason. 28 United States Code 528 specifically lists not just political conflict of interest, but the appearance of political conflict of interest. It's just simply not enough that you vouch for your team. The interests of justice demand that no perceived bias exists. I can't imagine a single prosecutor or judge that I have ever appeared in front of would be comfortable with these circumstances.
An attorney general who wrote a 16-page memo
relationship to the opponent of the person
that
being
there was no
investigated.
such thing as obstruction of justice, and then made the decision once he became attorney general.
Of those 19 lawyers, 14 of them were transferred from elsewhere in the Department of Justice. Only 5 came from outside.
And half of them had a direct relationship, political or personal, with the opponent of the person you were investigating. And that's my point. I wonder if not a single word in this entire report was changed, but rather the only difference was we switched Hillary Clinton and President Trump. If Peter Strzok had texted those terrible things about Hillary Clinton instead of President Trump, if a team of lawyers worked for, donated thousands of dollars to, and went to Trump's parties instead of Clinton's, I don't think we'd be here trying to prop up an obstruction allegation. My colleagues would have spent the last 4 months accusing your team of being bought and paid for by the Trump campaign, and we couldn't trust a single word of this report. They would still be accusing the president of conspiracy with Russia, and they would be accusing your team of aiding and abetting in that, with that conspiracy. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado.
Director Mueller, thank you for your service to our country. I'd like to talk to you about one of the other incidents of obstruction, and that's the evidence in your report showing the president directing his son and his communications director to issue a false public statement in June of 2017 about a meeting between his campaign and Russian individuals at Trump Tower in June of 2016. According to your report, Mr. Trump Jr. was the only Trump associate who participated in that meeting and who declined to be voluntarily interviewed by your office. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did Mr. Trump Jr. or his counsel ever communicate to your office any intent to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination?
I'm not going to answer that.
You did pose written questions to the president about his knowledge of the Trump Tower meeting. You also asked him about whether or not he had directed a false press statement. The president did not answer at all that question, correct?
I don't have it in front of me. I take your word.
I can represent to you that Appendix C, specifically C13, states as much. According to page 100 of Volume 2 of your report, your investigation found that Hope Hicks, the president's communications director, in June of 2017 was shown emails that set up the Trump Tower meeting, and she told your office that she was, quote, shocked by the emails because they looked, quote, really bad. True?
Do you have the citation?
Sure. It's page 100 of Volume 2.
Why don't they start with this? This sounds better. Sounds a little more...
While you're flipping to that page, Director Mueller, I will also tell you that according to page 99 of Volume 2, those emails in question stated, according to your report, that the Crown Prosecutor of Russia had offered to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia as part of Russia and its government's support for Mr. Trump. Trump Jr. responded, if it's what you say, I love it. And he, Kushner, and Manafort met with the Russian attorneys and several other Russian individuals at Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, end quote, correct?
Generally accurate.
Isn't it true that Ms. Hicks told your office that she went multiple times to the president to, quote, urge him that they should be fully transparent about the June 9th meeting, end quote, but the president each time said no, correct?
Accurate.
And the reason was because of those emails,
We're
which
like
the president,
Hicks.
quote, believed would not leak, correct?
Well, I'm not certain how it's characterized, but generally correct.
Did the president direct Ms. Hicks to say, quote, only that Trump Jr. took a brief meeting and it was about Russian adoption, end quote, because Trump Jr.'s statement to the New York Times, quote, said too much, according to page 102 of Volume 2?
Okay.
Correct?
Let me just check one thing. Yes.
And according to Ms. Hicks, the president still directed her to say the meeting was only about Russian adoption, correct?
Yes.
Despite knowing that to be untrue. Thank you, Director Mueller. I yield back the balance of my own time.
Mr. Mueller, you've been asked over here on the far right, sir. You've been asked a lot of questions here today, and to be frank, you performed as most of us expected. You've stuck closely to your report, and you have declined to answer many of our questions on both sides. As the closer for the Republican side, I know you're glad to get to the close, I want to summarize the highlights of what we have heard and what we know. You spent 2 years and nearly 30 million taxpayer dollars and unlimited resources to prepare a nearly 450-page report, which you described today as very thorough. Millions of Americans today maintain genuine concerns about your work, in large part because of the infamous and widely publicized bias of your investigating team members, which we now know included 14 Democrats and 0 Republicans. Campaign finance reports later showed that team, excuse me, it's my time. That team of Democrat investigators you hired donated more than $60,000 to the Hillary Clinton campaign and other Democratic candidates. Your team also included Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, which have been discussed today, and they had the lurid text messages that confirmed they openly mocked and hated Donald Trump and his supporters, and they vowed to take him out. Mr. Ratcliffe asked you earlier this morning, quote, can you give me an example other than Donald Trump where the Justice Department determined that an investigated person was not exonerated because their innocence was not conclusively determined, unquote? You answered, I cannot. Sir, that is unprecedented. The president believed from the very beginning that you and your special counsel team had serious conflicts. This is stated in the report and acknowledged by everybody. And yet, President Trump cooperated fully with the investigation. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and he encouraged all witnesses to cooperate with the investigation and produced more than 1.4 million pages of information and allowed over 40 witnesses who were directly affiliated with the White House or his campaign. Your report acknowledges on page 61, volume 2, that a volume of evidence exists of the president telling many people privately, quote, the president was concerned about the impact of the Russian investigation on his ability to govern and to address important foreign relations issues and even matters of national security. And on page 174, volume 2, your report also acknowledges that the Supreme Court has held, quote, the president's removal powers are at their zenith with respect to principal officers, that is, officers who must be appointed by the president and who report to him directly. The president's exclusive and illimitable power of removal of those principal officers furthers the president's ability to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed, unquote. And that would even include the Attorney General. Look, in spite of all of that, nothing ever happened to stop or impede your special counsel's investigation. Nobody was fired by the president, nothing was curtailed, and the investigation continued unencumbered for 22 long months. As you finally concluded in volume 1, the evidence, quote, did not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russian election interference, unquote. And the evidence, quote, did not establish that the president or those close to him were involved in any Russian conspiracies or had an unlawful relationship with any Russian official, unquote. Over those 22 long months that your investigation dragged along, the president became increasingly frustrated, as many of the American people did, with its effects on our country and his ability to govern. He vented about this to his lawyer and his close associates, and he even shared his frustrations, as we all know,
How can we round up more immigrants
while the president's social
and
media
torture more
accounts might have
children if I'm
influenced
being
some in the media
investigated?
or the opinion of some of the American people, none of those audiences were targets or witnesses in your investigation. The president never affected
can't roll
anybody's
back more
testimony. He never
EPA
demanded
regulations.
to end the investigation or demanded that
Are we
you be
gonna
terminated,
get
and he never misled Congress, the
brain-damaging
DOJ,
toxins
or
in
the
kids'
special counsel.
systems?
Those, sir, are
I
undisputed
have
facts.
to ask questions about
There will be a
time
lot of
again.
discussion.
There are
I predict
neurological
today, great
diseases
frustration
who are
throughout the
not being
country
able to
about the
grow
fact
in
that you wouldn't
children
answer
as
any
we
questions
speak.
here about the origins of this whole charade, which was the infamous Christopher Steele dossier, now proven to be totally bogus, even though it is listed and specifically referenced in your report. But as our hearing is concluding, we apparently will get no comment on that from you. Mr. Mueller, there's one primary reason why you were called here today and by the Democrat majority of our committee. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle just want political cover. They desperately wanted you today to tell them they should impeach the president. But the one thing you have said very clearly today is that your report is complete and thorough, and you completely agree with and stand by its recommendations and all of its content. Is that right?
True.
Mr. Mueller, one last important question. Your report does not recommend impeachment, does it?
I'm not going to talk about recommendations.
It does not conclude that impeachment would be appropriate here,
I'm not
right?
going to talk about that.
Interesting.
That issue.
That's one of the many things you wouldn't talk about today, but I think we can all draw our own conclusions. I do thank you for your service to the country, and I'm glad this charade will come to an end soon, and we can get back to the important business of this committee with its broad jurisdiction of so many important issues for the country. With that, I yield back.
But nobody calls Sean Hannity.
The gentleman yields back. I want to announce that our intent was to conclude this hearing at around 11:45. All of the Republican members have now asked their questions, but we have a few remaining Democratic members. They will be limiting their questions, so with Director Mueller's indulgence, we
I
expect
am
to finish
very
within
ready
15
to
minutes.
be done.
The
I'm
gentlelady from
tired.
Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank
Yes,
you,
but
Director
unironically.
Mueller. Your investigations of the Russian attack on our democracy and of obstruction of justice were extraordinarily productive. In under 2 years, you charged at least 37 people or entities with crimes. You convicted 7 individuals, 5 of whom were top Trump campaign or White House aides. Charges remain pending against more than 24 Russian persons or entities, and against others. Now, let me start with those 5 Trump campaign or administration aides that you convicted. Would you agree with me that they are Paul Manafort, President Trump's campaign manager?
You'd have to remind me.
Rick Gates, President Trump's deputy campaign manager.
It's
Michael
sort of
Flynn,
fascinating
President
that Mueller
Trump's
has
former
now
national security
said
advisor.
twice
Michael Cohen,
that
the
he will
president's
not
personal attorney.
comment on
George
whether the
Papadopoulos, President Trump's
report
former campaign foreign policy advisor.
calls for impeachment.
Correct? Correct. And the 6th Trump
He doesn't even say I stand by the report.
Year, correct? And
Not
that
touching
person
that.
would be Roger Stone.
It's interesting.
Correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
I'm not certain what you said by Stone, but he is in another court system, as I indicated before.
Exactly. He's
And
still under
I
still under
do not want to
investigation.
discuss.
Correct. Thank you. And there are many other charges as well, correct?
Correct.
So, sir, I just want to thank you so much in my limited time today for your team, the work that you did and your dedication. In less than 2 years, your team was able to uncover an incredible amount of information related to Russia's attack on our elections and to obstruction of justice. And there's still more that we have to learn. Despite facing unfair attacks by the president, and even here today, your work has been substantive and fair. The work has laid the critical foundation for our investigation, and for that, I thank you. I thank you. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. Director Mueller, I'm disappointed that some have questioned your motives throughout this process, and I want to take a moment to remind the American people of who you are in your exemplary service to our country. You are a Marine. You served in Vietnam and earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, correct?
No kidding.
Which president appointed you to become the United States Attorney for Massachusetts?
Which senator?
Which president?
Oh, which president?
Oh, my God.
I think that was President Bush.
According to my notes, it was President Ronald Reagan had the honor to do so. Under whose Under whose administration did you serve as the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the DOJ's criminal
Good job,
division?
buddy.
Under which president?
Yep.
That would be George Bush 1.
That is correct, President George H.W. Bush.
Is he actually meaning to do like a quiz? I mean, he's trying to say, he's trying to establish that Mueller is credible, which is just stunning.
Is that correct?
Like they think that this is necessary at this point.
Which president
so stupid
first appointed you?
Bush.
You're extremely well endowed, correct?
98-0, correct?
Surprising.
And you were sworn in as director.
You lied about WMDs for a Republican president, correct?
You helped to protect this nation.
You goaded
against
mentally
another
limited
attack.
Chechen
You did such an
boys into
outstanding
fake
job that when
terrorist
your
attacks
10-year
to
term
disrupt
expired,
Al-Qaeda,
the
correct?
Senate unanimously voted to extend your
Didn't
term
you
for another 2
infiltrate
years,
some student groups in college? Well, that's also true.
You monitored halal dinners at colleges across the northeastern seaboard. Is that correct?
If they're really looking to convince
were in
Republicans,
turmoil. You must have known there would be an extraordinary challenge. Why did you accept?
I'm not going to get into that's a little bit off track.
can we speed this up?
Yeah,
like
no
literally,
shit.
is there
Even Mueller wants to speed it up.
Some people have attacked the political motivations of your team, even suggested your investigation was a witch hunt. When you considered people to join your team, did you ever even once
think they're done?
ask about their political affiliation?
Never once.
In your entire career as a law enforcement official, have you ever made a
Before
hiring
you joined my
decision
team,
based upon a
do you
person's
think that there are
political
multiple
affiliation?
genders and that Donald Trump should be sent back to Russia?
I'm not surprised.
If I might just interject.
The answer isn't yes to both of those questions. Get the fuck out of my
report
office.
that's been discussed here today was a result of a team of agents and lawyers who were absolutely exemplary and were hired because of the value they could contribute to getting the job done and getting it done expeditiously.
God, you guys are
Sir, you're
really
a
bad at
patriot.
this.
Clear to me in reading your report and listening to your testimony today, you acted fairly and with restraint.
Shut
there
up.
are circumstances where you could have filed charges against
If
other
you didn't
people
call
mentioned in the
Donald
report,
Trump
but you declined.
the
Not
president,
every prosecutor
Cheeto,
does
and
that.
chief,
Certainly
you
in a
could
one-on-one
not work
witch
on my
hunt. The
team.
attacks made against you and your team intensified because your report is damning. And I believe you did uncover substantial evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors. Let me also say something else that you are right about. The only remedy for this situation is for Congress to take action. I yield back.
Good.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Good morning, Director Mueller. Madeline Dean.
Gotcha, sorry.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about public confusion connected with Attorney General Barr's release of your report.
This is good.
I will be quoting your March 27th letter. Sir, in that letter, and at several other times, did you convey to the Attorney General that the, quote, introductions and executive summaries of our 2-volume report accurately summarize this office's work and conclusions, end quote?
And I have to say that the letter itself speaks for itself.
And those were your words in that letter. Continuing with your letter, you wrote to the Attorney General that, quote, the summary letter that the department sent to Congress and released to the public late in the afternoon of March 24th did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of this office's work and conclusions, end quote. Is that correct?
Again, I rely on the letter itself for its terms.
Thank you. What was it about the report's context, nature, substance that the Attorney General's letter did not capture?
I think we captured that in the March 27th responsive letter.
And this is from the 27th letter. What were some of the specifics that you thought?
I direct you to the letter itself.
Okay. You finished that letter by saying there is now public confusion about critical aspects as a result of our investigation. Could you tell us specifically some of the public confusion you identified?
Not generally. Again, I go back to the letter, and the letter speaks for itself.
And could Attorney General Barr have avoided public confusion if he had released your summaries and executive introduction and summaries?
And I don't feel comfortable speculating on that.
Shifting to May 30th, the Attorney General in an interview with CBS News said that you could have reached, quote, you could have reached a decision as to whether it was criminal activity, end quote, on the part of the president. Did the Attorney General or his staff ever tell you that he thought you should make a decision on whether the president engaged in criminal activity?
I'm not going to speak to what the Attorney General was thinking or saying.
If the Attorney General had directed you or ordered you to make a decision on whether the president engaged in criminal activity, would you have so done?
I can't answer that question in the vacuum.
What?
Director Mueller, again, I thank you for being here. I agree with your March 27th letter. There was public confusion, and the president took full advantage of that confusion by falsely claiming your report found no obstruction. Let us be clear, your report did not exonerate the president. Instead, it provided substantial evidence of obstruction of justice, leaving Congress to do its duty. We shall not shrink from that duty. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I have a point of inquiry over on your left.
Gentleman will state his point of inquiry.
Was the point of this hearing to get Mr. Mueller to recommend impeachment?
That is not a fair point of inquiry. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
Director Mueller,
Mr. Chairman.
to your
The gentlelady from
so
Florida
much
is recognized.
for coming here. You're a patriot. I want to refer you now to Volume 2, page 158. You wrote that, quote, the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests. Is that right?
That is accurate, and that is what we found.
And you're basically referring to senior advisors who disobeyed the president's orders, like White House counsel Don McGahn, former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski. Is that right?
Well, we have not specified the persons mentioned.
Well, in page 158, White House counsel Don McGahn, quote, did not tell the acting attorney general that the special counsel must be removed, but was instead prepared to resign over the president's orders. You also explained that an attempt to obstruct justice does not have to succeed to be a crime, right?
True.
Simply attempting to obstruct justice can be a crime, correct?
Yes.
So even though the president's aides refused to carry out his orders to interfere with your investigation, that is not a defense to obstruction of justice by this president, is it?
I'm not going to speculate.
So to reiterate, simply trying to obstruct justice can be a crime, correct?
Yes.
And you say that the president's efforts to influence the investigation were, quote, mostly unsuccessful. And that's because not all
of his efforts were unsuccessful, right?
You're reading into what we have written in the report.
I was going to ask you if you could just tell me which ones you had in mind as successful when you wrote that sentence.
I'm going to pass on that.
Yeah. Director Mueller, today we've talked a lot about the separate acts by this president,
why?
but you also wrote in your report that, quote, the overall pattern of the
He
president's
said there are
conduct
things that are
towards
successful.
the investigations
Obstructed
can
justice.
shed light
now you
on
gotta
the
figure it
nature
out on
of the
your own,
president's
Jew
acts,
boy.
and the inferences can be drawn about his intent, correct?
Accurate recitation from the
And-
report.
It's stunning that
Right,
we get this
and
report,
on
we
page
don't get that
158
answer.
again, I think it's important for everyone to note that the president's conduct had a significant change when he realized that the investigations were conducted to investigate his obstruction acts. So in other words, when the American people are deciding whether the president committed obstruction of justice, they need to look at all of the president's conduct and overall pattern of behavior. Is that correct?
I don't disagree.
Thank you. Dr. Mueller, Director Mueller, doctor also, I'll designate that too. I have certainly made up my mind about whether what we have reviewed today meets the elements of obstruction, including whether there was corrupt intent. And what is clear is that anyone else, including some members of Congress, would have been charged with crimes for these acts. We would not have allowed this behavior from any of the previous 44 presidents. We should not allow it now or for the future to protect our democracy. And yes, we will continue to investigate because, as you clearly state at the end of your report, no one is above the law. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Texas.
Director Mueller, you wrote in your report that you, quote, determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment, end quote. Was that in part because of an opinion by the Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel, that a sitting president can't be charged with a crime?
Yes.
Director Mueller, at your May 29th, 2019 press conference, you explained that, quote, the opinion says that the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, end quote. That process other than the criminal justice system for accusing a president of wrongdoing, is that impeachment?
I'm not going to comment on that.
What?
In your report, you also
what's he
wrote
alluding
that you
to?
did not
I'm
want
not
to,
commenting
quote,
on the
potentially
illusion either.
preempt
Good try.
constitutional
Milkshaking.
processes for
could
addressing
be
presidential
milkshaking.
misconduct, end quote. For the non-lawyers in the room, what did you mean by, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes?
I'm not going to try to explain that.
That actually is coming from page 1 of volume 2.
That's
In the
stunning.
footnote is the reference to this. What are those constitutional processes?
I think I heard you mention at least one.
Impeachment, correct?
I
I'm not
think
going
I
to comment.
Okay, that is
I mean,
one of
that's
the
clearly-
constitutional
Yeah.
processes listed in the report in the footnote in
coughed
volume
twice.
2.
I mean, honestly,
Your report
this is
documents the
childish.
many ways the president sought to interfere with your investigation. And
Let's
you
pull that
state in
exchange.
your report on page 10, volume 2, that interfering with a congressional inquiry or investigation with corrupt intent can also constitute obstruction of justice.
True.
Well, the president has told us
like
that he intends to fight all the subpoenas.
basically
his
like-
continued efforts to interfere with investigations of his potential misconduct
like a
certainly
pad in
reinforce
front of
the
a cat
importance
and
of the
saying, like,
process.
touch it.
The
I'll
Constitution
touch it, but
requires
I'm not gonna say
to,
what it
quote,
is. It's just
formally
ridiculous.
accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing, as you cited in the report.
It's
And
just
in
like
this
the Bobby
this
Lee
hearing has
impression.
been very helpful to this committee as it exercises its constitutional duty to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment against the president. I agree with you, Director Mueller, that we all have a vital role in holding this president accountable for his actions. More
Yeah, if
than
you
that,
say so.
I believe we in Congress
Vital role
have a
is your
duty to
words.
demand accountability
we're
and
gonna start a
safeguard
new
one of
stream
our
as soon as this
nation's
is over.
highest
We got
principles
4 hours?
that no one is
Okay.
above the law.
We will.
From everything that I have heard you say here today, it's clear that anyone else would have been prosecuted based on the evidence available in your report. It now falls on us to hold President Trump accountable. Thank you for being here. Chairman, I yield back.
You say so. Am I even sitting
Mr.
here?
Chairman,
I don't know.
gentlelady yields back.
Just a point of privilege, you and I agree.
Point of personal privilege.
I just want to thank the chairman. We did get in our time after this was first developed to us. We did both get in time. Our side got our 5 minutes in.
We got a time. We got a time.
Mr. Mueller, thank you for being here. And I join the chairman and thank you for being here.
Thank you,
Thank you. Director Mueller, we thank you for attending today's hearing.
We're done.
Before we can
So, folks, well, let's just hear what he's saying here.
quiet
I'm
hungry. While the witness exits the room.
Oh, he's just talking about. He's just doing the.
Once again, if you
Also,
like a back rub or anything,
after we're
Mr.
done
Mueller,
here, please everyone meet across the hall. We have some refreshments.
We have some
and
nosh.
A little bit of nosh.
Can I get you some nosh, Mr.
So
Mueller? We
here's the deal,
admire you
folks.
so much.
We're going to sign off. We'll be back on for the Intel hearing, and but before that, we're going to come back on in 5 minutes. We're going to just run down the highlights of this, basically Cliff Notes, probably 30 minutes of it. All right, we'll be back in 5 minutes.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I